Hey guys, tonight we're sailing into the strange, ingenious, and occasionally terrifying world of how pirates actually talk to each other across open water. No radios, no phones, nothing but flags, gunfire, lantern light, and a rumour network that moved faster than most navies could sail. We're talking about a black flag that meant something very different from a red one. A chest of medicine worth somewhere around £300 used as a hostage negotiation off the coast of Charleston, and a royal pardon that pirates in a lawless harbour argued over for weeks before deciding whether to believe it. Welcome to the so-called Golden Age of Piracy, roughly the 1690s through the early 1730s, a world with no satellites, no Morse code, not even a dependable postal service, and yet a pirate crew 100 miles from land could still coordinate an ambush, spread a warning, or negotiate for their lives using nothing but cloth, smoke, and sound. Go ahead and dim the lights. If there's a fan nearby, let it hum low, the way wind moves through rigging on a long night watch, some steady, below decks kind of white noise. You're warm right now, lying somewhere that isn't rocking, isn't leaking, isn't 3 weeks from the nearest doctor. That won't stay true for very long. At least not in the story. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. At a little before 10 in the morning, sometime in 1720, the lookout aboard a Bristol-registered merchant sloop, somewhere in the waters off the Carolina coast, called down that a ship had appeared on the horizon flying an English ensign, same as any of 100 other vessels working that stretch of sea. Nothing unusual. The merchant captain didn't so much as reach for his glass a second time. English ships were common as gulls out here, and this one kept its distance, holding a course that looked, for all the world, like simple bad luck in timing rather than deliberate pursuit. The wind was light, the sea was flat enough to make out individual gulls trailing the other vessel's wake, and for the better part of an hour nothing about the morning suggested it would end up in anyone's deposition. It took roughly that hour for the other ship to close the gap enough that its intentions stopped being ambiguous. By then, there wasn't much left to do but watch. The English colours came down. A different flag went up in their place. Black, with some design on it too far off yet to read clearly. Just a shape and a colour that meant something the merchant crew's stomachs understood before their eyes fully resolved the details. A single cannon fired across the bow, not aimed to hit anything. Just loud enough to make a point. The point, understood by every sailor on that deck without needing translation, was simple. Strike your colours, or the next shot won't be a warning. This is the story of the flag, arguably the single most efficient, most misunderstood piece of technology the entire era of piracy ever produced. Not a weapon, not a ship, not even a man. A rectangle of dyed cloth, run up a halyard, readable from a mile off, with nothing more than a decent telescope and clear morning light. And somehow, for the better part of 3 centuries since, that rectangle of cloth has done more to shape the popular idea of piracy than any actual pirate captain ever managed on his own. Here's the thing worth sitting with before the flags themselves get interesting. None of this started as a pirate invention. Long before anyone thought to weaponize a piece of cloth for terror, ordinary ships at sea were already using flags as their entire vocabulary of identity. A national ensign, flown from the stern of a vessel, told every other ship on the horizon who you were without a single word needing to cross the water between you. It's easy to forget, sitting in a world of instant identification, just how much information a single piece of dyed fabric had to carry, when it was the only information available at any real distance. A Dutch flag meant Dutch cargo, Dutch law, Dutch consequences if you interfered with it without cause. A Spanish flag meant the same, for Spain. Sailors spent entire careers learning to read these signals at a glance, the way a modern driver reads a stoplight without consciously translating red into stop. Pirates understood this system with total clarity, and understanding it is exactly what let them break it so effectively. If a flag told you who a ship claimed to be, then flying the wrong flag on purpose became one of the oldest tricks available at sea, used by legitimate navies for centuries before any pirate crew ever touched it. Sailing under false colours, showing a friendly flag to close the gap on a target before revealing your actual intentions, was standard practice in naval warfare generally. There was even something resembling an unwritten rule of engagement wrapped around the tactic. Custom held that a ship could approach under false colours, but was expected to run up its true flag before actually opening fire. A strange little formality in the middle of what was otherwise organised violence. Whether that rule was consistently honoured, pirate or otherwise, is a separate question, and the honest answer, drawn from surviving depositions given by merchant captains who lived long enough to testify about it, leans heavily toward not when it was inconvenient. By a sailor's second or third close encounter with this particular trick, working Caribbean or American waters sometime in the 1710s or 1720s, distrust had usually become a permanent condition. Here's the uncomfortable truth about any system built entirely on visual trust. It only functions until someone realizes trust itself is exploitable. And pirates, whatever else history says about them, were rarely slow learners on that particular point. Admiralty court depositions from the period, sworn statements taken from captured or escaped sailors describing what had happened to their ships, repeat this pattern often enough that it stops looking like an isolated trick and starts looking like standard operating procedure. A friendly flag. A closing distance. Then, all at once, the wrong flag, and no more pretending. Once a ship had actually closed the distance and revealed itself, the flag's job wasn't finished, because the specific message it carried mattered as much as the reveal itself. This is where the vocabulary gets genuinely interesting, and also where a significant amount of scholarly disagreement lies, because a large share of what popular culture believes it knows about pirate flags traces back to one deeply unreliable source. That source is Captain Charles Johnson's A General History of the Pirates, published in 1724, a book that shaped nearly every pirate biography written after it, and whose own author's identity is still disputed among historians today. Some scholars believe Johnson may have been a pen name used by Daniel Defoe, the author of Robinson Crusoe, though that theory has never been conclusively proven either way. What matters more for tonight's purposes is that Johnson dramatised freely. He filled gaps in the record with material that made for better reading, and generation after generation of later writers copied his details forward as though they carried the weight of sworn courtroom testimony. So wherever a flag description in this chapter leans on something closer to Admiralty records, ship's logs, or governor's correspondence, that will be noted. Wherever it traces back to Johnson alone, that gets treated the same way legend gets treated everywhere else in tonight's story. Interesting, possibly true, not settled fact. With that caveat sitting up front, here's what does appear to be broadly reliably true. By the early 1700s, a black flag had become the closest thing pirates possessed to a shared, recognisable symbol. Though there was no single official design, and no pirate authority issuing an approved pattern. Every captain who flew one more or less improvised his own, and the specific imagery ranged wildly. Skulls, full skeletons, hourglasses, crossed weapons, sometimes 3 or 4 of these symbols crowded onto the same small piece of cloth, like a very grim coat of arms assembled by committee. A plain black flag, without any additional design at all, seems to have carried a fairly consistent meaning across multiple independent accounts. Surrender now. And there is a reasonable chance you and your crew walk away from this, striking your own colours in response. Physically hauling your ship's flag back down its halyard was the universally understood answer, a gesture so old and so widely recognised across every navy and merchant fleet of the era that it required no negotiation at all. Cloth down, hostilities paused. It's a small, almost bureaucratic little ritual, buried inside what was otherwise an act of naked robbery on the open ocean. The red flag meant something considerably darker, and this is where the phrase most people already know, Jolly Roger, may actually originate. One theory, favoured by a number of maritime historians though never universally agreed upon, traces the term back to the French phrase joli rouge, meaning roughly pretty red, a reference to the blood-coloured flags that some pirate and privateer crews flew earlier in the era, before black eventually became the more common choice. A red flag, unlike a black one, generally signalled the opposite of mercy. It meant no quarter would be given at all, that any resistance would be met with maximum, deliberate violence rather than a straightforward robbery followed by release. Picture, if it helps, the modern equivalent of two different alarm tones in the same building, one meaning, please evacuate calmly, the other meaning, something considerably more urgent. Same basic device, wildly different consequences depending on which one you happen to hear drifting across open water. By the time a working merchant sailor had spotted 3 or 4 black-flagged ships over the span of an ordinary career in Caribbean or American shipping lanes, something like an informal field guide had usually taken shape in his head, a word-of-mouth taxonomy of colours and meanings, constantly updated by rumour, by survivors' accounts traded over drinks in port taverns, and occasionally by newspapers that covered pirate trials in enough detail to mention what flag a particular crew had flown. This informal knowledge network mattered enormously, because it meant a flag's reputation could travel ahead of the ship that flew it, arriving in port towns weeks before the vessel itself ever appeared on anyone's horizon. Individual captains, meanwhile, appear to have leaned hard into personalisation, less out of simple vanity, most historians argue, than out of pure practical terror economics. A reputation, once firmly established, did a meaningful share of the actual fighting for you before a single shot was fired. If a merchant crew recognised a specific flag and believed they knew exactly what kind of captain flew it, they might strike their colours and hand over the cargo without any resistance at all, sparing both sides the risk, expense and mess of an actual engagement. Fear, in other words, functioned as a form of currency cheaper than gunpowder, and a well-known flag was psychological credit a captain could spend without ever lifting a cutlass. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it inverts the image most people carry of pirate violence. The most successful pirate captains weren't necessarily the ones who fought the most battles. They were often the ones who'd built a reputation frightening enough that they rarely had to. The flag most persistently associated with Edward Teach, the pirate the world remembers as Blackbeard, is a genuinely striking image, a horned skeleton, sometimes described in later retellings as the devil himself, holding an hourglass in one hand as a blunt reminder that time was running out, and in the other hand a spear driven through a bleeding heart. It's an unsettling design, and it shows up today on merchandise, in documentaries, and across popular imagination, as though it carried the same historical certainty as his physical beard. Here's the complication historians keep running into. The earliest surviving visual depictions of this specific flag design date from long after Teach's death in November of 1718, and no surviving contemporary eyewitness account from his actual lifetime describes it in this kind of visual detail. It may be entirely accurate, preserved through oral tradition until someone finally drew it down. It may equally be a later invention that attached itself to the most famous pirate name available, the 18th century equivalent of a story so satisfying nobody thought to fact-check it before repeating it forward. The honest, careful answer, the one any responsible historian gives, is that we simply don't fully know. And treating it as settled fact does a disservice to how history actually works. One document at a time, not one legend repeated confidently enough that it starts to feel true. Bartholomew Roberts, known to his contemporaries and to history afterward as Black Bart, presents a somewhat better corroborated case, still filtered through Johnson's unreliable lens, but supported in outline by other period sources describing his campaign. Roberts, by most estimates the most successful pirate of the entire Golden Age, measured in ships captured, a number that ran into the hundreds across his relatively brief career, reportedly flew more than one flag over the course of his time at sea, including a design showing his own figure standing beside a skeletal figure of death, the two of them holding a shared hourglass between them, a measurement of time that applied equally to captor and captive alike. Another version of his flag reportedly carried the initials AB and AM, standing for a Barbadian's head and a Martinican's head, a direct, personalised threat aimed squarely at the governors of Barbados and Martinique after both had sent ships specifically tasked with hunting him down. Whether every detail of that account survived Johnson's retelling with perfect accuracy, the underlying mechanism still holds up under scrutiny from other sources. A flag could function as an actual piece of correspondence, addressed to one specific person, flown for an entire crew and every enemy vessel on the horizon to read simultaneously, a message nobody could intercept because it was never hidden to begin with. Somewhere off the coast of the Caribbean in 1720, 2 colonial governors were, in effect, being sent hate mail nobody could stop from arriving. The flag popularly attributed to John Rackham, better remembered by his nickname Calico Jack, a skull positioned above 2 crossed swords rather than the more familiar crossed bones, is one of the most recognisable pirate flags in modern branding, appearing on everything from clothing to tattoo flash art to amusement park signage. It's also, uncomfortably, one of the least reliably documented. The specific evidence connecting this exact design to Rackham during his actual lifetime is thin, and much of its modern popularity likely owes more to 20th century design history than to any surviving primary source from the 1720s. That doesn't mean it's necessarily false. It means, as with so much of this chapter, that the honest answer sits closer to widely believed than to documented. And that distinction matters more than it might seem, because it's exactly the kind of gap where legend quietly slides in and starts wearing the costume of fact. What's easy to lose underneath all the skull imagery and the horror movie iconography that later centuries layered onto this subject is how genuinely functional the whole system actually was, purely as a communication tool built entirely without radio, telegraph, or any means of remote contact. A flag wasn't primarily decoration or branding, though it did double as both by necessity. It was, first and foremost, a long-distance instruction, readable across water no cannon of the era could yet reliably reach, delivered without a single word ever needing to travel between 2 crews who might never come within shouting distance of one another before the entire encounter was already decided one way or the other. Strike your colours, and this ends quietly. Cargo lost, but crew intact. Don't. And the next flag you see might be red, and by then negotiation was rarely still on the table. By around 1730, the specific golden age that produced most of these famous flags had largely burned itself out, crushed under a combination of aggressive naval suppression campaigns, expiring royal pardons, and a steadily shrinking number of harbours still willing to shelter a pirate crew. But the flag itself outlived every captain who ever flew one. It survived Johnson's dramatisations, survived 2 centuries of reprinting and embellishment in cheap adventure fiction, and eventually settled into the single most recognisable symbol in the popular imagination of piracy, the skull and crossbones, a design that in historical reality represented only a fraction of the actual flags flown during the period. But that 19th and 20th century fiction, Robert Louis Stevenson's 1883 novel about a certain treasure map chief among them, cemented as the universal shorthand for the entire profession. A rectangle of black cloth, invented for terror and negotiation on the open Atlantic, ended up decorating children's birthday parties roughly 300 years later. Somewhere along that long, strange journey, most of the original message got lost entirely. But the object survived, largely intact, which is more than most 18th century objects, and most 18th century pirates ever managed. Consider for a moment what all of this actually looked like from the deck of the ship doing the pursuing. Because the flag wasn't a passive symbol sitting there waiting to be noticed, it required deliberate, physical work at exactly the right moment. A crewman stationed near the halyard, the line used to raise and lower a flag, had to wait for a signal, usually a shouted order from the quartermaster or captain, then haul the false colours down and run the true flag up in a matter of seconds. Timed to land at the precise moment maximum psychological effect could be achieved, close enough that the target couldn't simply outrun the reveal, far enough that a single cannon shot across the bow still carried a believable threat of a second, less merciful one. Get the timing wrong, haul the flag up too early, and you tipped your hand before you were close enough to press the advantage. Too late, and you'd lost the element of surprise that made the whole ruse work in the first place. It's easy to imagine this as theatre, and in a sense it was, but it was theatre with genuinely lethal stakes riding on a few seconds of rope work, performed by ordinary sailors who'd rehearsed the sequence enough times that it became something closer to muscle memory than performance. Some of the clearest surviving evidence for how this actually played out doesn't come from Johnson's dramatised chronicle at all, but from the far drier, far more reliable paperwork of colonial admiralty courts, where captured or escaped sailors gave sworn depositions describing exactly what they'd witnessed before losing their cargo, their ship, or occasionally their freedom for a period of forced service aboard the pirate vessel itself. These depositions rarely read like adventure stories. They read like insurance claims, flat and procedural, which is precisely what makes them valuable. A captain describing, under oath, the moment a black flag replaced a false Dutch or English ensign wasn't trying to entertain anyone. He was trying to establish, for a court that might later determine compensation or prosecute the men responsible if they were ever caught, exactly what had happened and in what order. Multiple depositions from the 1717 and 1718 period, describing entirely separate incidents involving entirely separate ships along the American coast, independently mention this same basic sequence: an approaching vessel under ordinary colours, a closing distance, then a sudden change of flag paired with a warning shot. When several unconnected witnesses, questioned separately, describe the same procedure without any apparent coordination between them, that's about as close to solid historical ground as this subject gets. And it's worth noting precisely because so much of the rest of pirate flag lore rests on considerably shakier footing. There's something worth pausing on here, a kind of quiet wonder underneath all the skulls and warning shots. An entire system of threat, negotiation and mercy, one capable of deciding whether a crew of total strangers lived or died, ran on nothing more sophisticated than dyed cloth, a length of rope, and the shared willingness of everyone at sea to agree, without any formal treaty ever being signed, on what a given colour meant. No committee designed this system. No admiralty issued a manual. It simply accumulated, ship by ship, encounter by encounter, until sailors on opposite sides of the law could read the same rectangle of fabric and understand instantly and without translation exactly what was being asked of them. It is, in its own bleak way, one of the more remarkable pieces of improvised human communication the age of sail ever produced. A flag could only carry a message as far as the horizon, though, and plenty of the most important pirate communication happened long before any ship came into view at all, in the daily, unglamorous business of simply staying in contact with a consort vessel across open ocean. The smell hits you before anything else does, tar and brine and the particular sourness of 100 and some men who haven't properly bathed in weeks, and it's how you know you're awake before your eyes have even bothered to open. You're on the dawn watch, somewhere in the Atlantic in 1718, aboard a pirate sloop sailing in company with a second vessel, a consort riding low on the horizon off your starboard bow. For a moment, everything feels almost peaceful. The sea is flat as a tabletop. The sky's gone the particular pale grey it turns just before sunrise actually commits to happening, and somewhere below deck someone is quietly, badly singing. That peace lasts exactly as long as it takes you to remember your actual job this morning, which is not enjoying the sunrise. It's counting. You've been posted, alongside a lanky, sharp-eyed young man everyone on board calls Ned, to watch the consort ship for a specific arrangement of flags at her foremast, a signal both crews agreed on before ever leaving port, because out here, with no way to shout across a mile of open water and be heard, a wrongly read flag could mean the difference between a coordinated ambush and two ships sailing blind into disaster without either one knowing the other was in trouble. Ned's only been aboard 6 weeks. He was a rigger on a Bristol merchantman before his ship was taken, and he was given the standard choice extended to a useful sailor with a trade: sign the articles or don't, and take your chances with whichever option seemed less permanent. He signed. Most did. He's got quick eyes and a habit of biting his lower lip when he's concentrating, which, on lookout duty, is more or less constantly. By your second week sailing in consort, you've learnt the actual code, and it turns out to be considerably more elaborate than a single flag meaning a single thing. A plain pennant at the foremast, agreed on before departure, means all's well, hold your present course. The same pennant lowered to half its height means enemy or unknown sail sighted, close up. A specific combination, 2 flags run up together at the main topmast, means make for the rendezvous point without delay. A pre-arranged location, sometimes a particular cove or careening beach, chosen precisely because no radio existed to name a new one on the fly if things went wrong. This wasn't a pirate invention, incidentally. Naval squadrons and merchant convoys of the period used strikingly similar systems, private signal books exchanged between captains before a voyage. Because the fundamental problem, 2 ships needing to coordinate without a live channel between them, applied equally to the Royal Navy and to a crew that had just mutinied against one. The quartermaster drilled this code into the crew the way a modern workplace might drill an emergency evacuation plan, tediously, repeatedly, and with visible impatience for anyone who still hadn't memorized it by the 3rd or 4th run-through. You'd stand at your post while he called out hypothetical scenarios, enemy sighted to windward, consort signals distress, and expected an immediate. Correct response naming the exact flag or gun combination that situation called for. Get it wrong twice in front of the assembled watch, and you could expect a fairly pointed comment about your prospects as a topman. It felt, frankly, a lot like schoolwork, an irony not lost on you given that most of the men aboard, yourself included, had left whatever schooling they'd had behind years before ever setting foot on a merchant deck, let alone a pirate one. But the repetition mattered precisely because a code that's only half remembered under pressure is a code that fails exactly when you need it most. Here's the thing about a signal system like this. It only works if everyone agreed on the vocabulary before the emergency happened, which means the entire arrangement had to be settled in port, on paper or by word of mouth, days or weeks before anyone actually needed it. You can't invent a new code mid-crisis with a mile of open water between you and the only other person who'd need to understand it. So the whole system got front-loaded, negotiated calmly over rum in a harbour somewhere, then trusted completely once the ships were out, where a misunderstanding could get people killed. It's not so different, if you squint, from agreeing on a meeting spot with a friend before your phones both die. Except here, the stakes were less we missed the movie, and considerably more one of us is now alone against a Royal Navy sloop. Night brought its own version of the same problem, and its own solution. Once the sun went down, flags became useless, invisible shapes against an invisible sky, so ships sailing in consort switched to lanterns, hung at the stern in specific numbers and arrangements agreed on the same way the daytime flags had been. A single lantern, steady and unmoving, told the following ship, "I'm here. Hold your position relative to me, don't lose me in the dark." 2 lanterns, one above the other, might signal a change of course was coming, giving the second ship a chance to adjust before the lead vessel actually turned, rather than discovering the change by nearly running into her stern. Ned drew this particular duty more nights than not, on account of what the quartermaster called. Not unkindly, his cat eyes, and you'd catch him some nights squinting so hard at that distant point of light across black water that he seemed to be trying to will it into staying put through sheer concentration. Flags and lanterns handled distance, but there were moments when the 2 ships closed near enough to attempt something considerably more direct, actual words, shouted across the gap with the help of a speaking trumpet, a long brass or tin horn shaped almost exactly like the modern idea of a megaphone, standard equipment aboard naval and merchant vessels of the period, and just as standard aboard a pirate sloop that had, in all likelihood, taken its speaking trumpet off some previous merchant prize, along with everything else useful it carried. You watched the quartermaster use his own trumpet one grey afternoon, when the consort had drawn within perhaps 80 or 100 yards, close enough for shouted words to survive the crossing if the wind cooperated. Any sail to the north of you carried clearly enough across the water that you heard the answer to. A single word, "non," relayed back through the other ship's own trumpet a moment later. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't private, either, since anyone aboard either vessel within earshot could hear both halves of the exchange, a limitation that meant genuinely sensitive orders still had to travel by flag code or by boat rather than open air. But for a quick, low-stakes question that needed answering now rather than in an hour's worth of careful signal reading, a trumpet and a cooperative wind did the job well enough. Signal guns solved a related but different problem, communicating not specific content but urgency, a way of saying "look here" immediately across a distance too great for a shouted word to carry at all. A single gun, fired and left to echo, generally meant something had changed, and attention was required now. Two guns, fired in close succession, carried greater weight still, often reserved for sighting an actual enemy sail or a ship flying naval colours, the single most dangerous piece of news a pirate crew could receive at sea. The system relied on something almost nobody thinks about today: sound travel slower than light and across even a mile of open water. The gap between seeing a puff of smoke from a distant gun and actually hearing the report could stretch into several full seconds, long enough that an inexperienced lookout might briefly doubt whether the shot he half heard had really happened at all. Ned, for his part, had a trick for it, counting under his breath between flash and sound the way you might count between lightning and thunder. An old habit apparently common enough among topmen of the era that more than one surviving account mentions sailors doing exactly the same thing, though rarely for anything as pleasant as judging the distance of a storm. All of this depended on the code staying secret, which was never guaranteed. And here's the darker side of an otherwise clever system. Signals only protect you as long as the other side hasn't learned to read them. Captured pirates. Questioned by colonial authorities eager for any advantage in an increasingly aggressive suppression campaign. Occasionally traded exactly this kind of information for leniency, and a deserter who'd served aboard a pirate crew carried the same knowledge with him wherever he went next, whether that was a naval vessel, a merchant ship, or simply a tavern conversation with the wrong person listening. There's no way to know how many pirate signal codes were quietly compromised this way over the course of the era, precisely because a code that's been silently cracked looks, from the outside, exactly like a code still working perfectly, right up until the moment a ship you expected to be a friendly consort turns out to be something considerably worse. Flying the correct signal because someone had told them what the correct signal was. That fear sat under everything, low and constant, which is exactly what made the afternoon 11 days into the voyage feel worse than it probably should have. A single gunshot from the consort then, a long, awful pause, a second. Unknown sail. Every hand not already occupied came up on deck, and you found yourself standing beside Ned at the rail, both of you squinting at a shape on the horizon that refused, for several genuinely unpleasant minutes, to resolve into anything identifiable. Ships this era, remember, had no way to simply ask the horizon what it was hiding. You waited, sails trimmed for a fast turn, either toward the stranger or away from it depending on what the next few minutes revealed, while the shape slowly grew close enough to show itself as a battered, low-riding fishing sloop, 3 men aboard, clearly more frightened of you than you'd been of it. The quartermaster hailed them by trumpet, and within the hour you had actual news, delivered second-hand the way most news arrived out here. The fishermen reporting they'd spoken 2 days earlier with a merchant crew who claimed a Royal Navy sloop had put into a nearby harbour for repairs. Information passed from stranger to you. 3 separate tellings removed from whatever had actually happened, and yet the single most useful piece of intelligence you'd received in 11 days at sea. Here's the thing about news at sea, in an age with no faster way to move it. You took it however it arrived, second-hand, uncertain, filtered through fishermen and merchants, and whoever else happened to cross your path, because the alternative was knowing nothing at all. 3 weeks out, a storm found you in the dark, the kind that arrives with almost no warning beyond a sudden wrongness in how the swells were moving, and by the time it broke fully, you'd lost sight of the consort's lantern entirely, swallowed by rain and spray and a sea that had gone from black to something closer to violent chaos. This is the moment the whole elaborate signal system had actually been built for, and also the moment it stopped working completely, because a lantern is useless in weather that extinguishes lanterns. For the better part of 6 hours, you had no idea whether the other ship still existed. No way to check, no way to ask, just the storm. And the waiting, and Ned somewhere near you gripping a line so tightly his knuckles had gone the colour of the sky. This is precisely why the rendezvous point mattered as much as any flag or lantern ever could. Before the two ships had ever left harbour together, both captains had agreed in advance on a specific location to reconvene if separated, a particular stretch of coastline, a known careening beach. Sometimes an entire pirate haven like the one you'll hear more about shortly, chosen because both crews could find it independently, without needing to communicate a single word to do so. The rendezvous point functioned as a message sent to the future, agreed on days before it was needed, and trusted to still be valid weeks later. A form of communication that required no ongoing contact at all once it had been established. By the time the storm finally broke, grey dawn revealing an empty, churned-up sea with no sign of the consort anywhere on the horizon, that pre-agreed point on the chart was the only thread still connecting two crews who had, for all practical purposes, just become completely unreachable to one another. What happens after a separation like that? Whether the two ships actually find each other again days later at that agreed patch of coastline is a different part of the story, and not one worth rushing past just yet. For now, there's a more immediate problem developing on deck, because somewhere in that 6 hours of chaos, a line parted under strain and took two of Ned's fingers with it, snapped clean by a block under sudden load while he fought to keep the signal lantern from being torn loose entirely. He didn't cry out, or at least nobody remembers him doing so, which somehow makes it worse to picture rather than better. The ship's surgeon, such as he was, more accustomed to setting broken bones than performing anything resembling delicate work, did what he could by lantern light that was, by grim coincidence, exactly the kind of light Ned had spent 3 weeks squinting at across open water. What happened next says something true about the world Ned had signed himself into, whatever else it says about the danger of it. Articles like the ones recorded for several pirate crews of this era, including versions attributed to Bartholomew Roberts' ship, specified fixed compensation for injuries suffered in the line of duty, sums that could run as high as 800 pieces of 8 for the loss of a leg or an arm, with smaller but still meaningful payouts specified for a single eye or a finger. This wasn't charity. It was contract, negotiated and agreed to by vote before the voyage ever began, the same democratic machinery that elected the captain also setting, in advance, what the crew owed one of its own for what he might lose in its service. Ned got his payout, considerably more money at once than a Bristol rigger's wages would have handed him in a year, for 2 fingers he'd never get back. Small comfort, probably, counted out in coin on a rolling deck. But comfort of a specific, guaranteed, contractual kind that very few sailors anywhere else in the 18th century could count on receiving at all. By the 4th day after the storm, you'd reached the agreed rendezvous point, a low, scrubby stretch of coastline chosen months earlier for its deep anchorage and its distance from any settlement large enough to house a customs official with opinions about who anchored there. Nothing on the horizon. You waited. Sailors are, whatever else they are, exceptionally practiced at waiting, and this particular kind of waiting had a specific shape to it, equal parts hope and the quiet, unspoken math everyone aboard was doing about what happens to a ship's plans if the consort simply never arrives. On the 5th morning, a sail appeared, and for a long, suspended minute nobody aboard your ship said anything at all, because a sail on the horizon could mean absolutely anything, a friend, a stranger, a Royal Navy frigate that had gotten there first and was waiting to see who showed up. Then the flag went up at her foremast, the exact pennant, the exact arrangement you'd agreed on weeks before in a completely different harbour, and something like a cheer went through the deck that had nothing performative about it at all. The consort had ridden out the same storm roughly 40 miles to the southeast, by her captain's later account, and had made straight for the rendezvous the moment the weather allowed, trusting entirely that you'd done the same. Neither ship had sent a single message to the other in 5 full days. And yet here you both were, in the same patch of ocean, because a plan made calmly in port had held up against a storm that had made a genuine mess of nearly everything else. Once both ships had anchored safely within the same sheltered water, the final piece of the communication puzzle came out. The one method that had been available all along, but only once the two crews were close enough to use it, without risking a boat in open ocean, a small rowed boat, sent across perhaps 200 yards of calm anchorage, carrying an actual person rather than a symbol. A boat crew of 4, Ned among them this time despite his bandaged hand, rowed across to the consort within an hour of anchoring, carrying news that no flag code had ever been designed to express in anything but the broadest strokes. There'd been talk apparently from a fishing boat encountered days earlier and questioned for news the way pirate crews questioned nearly everyone they encountered. Of a Royal Navy sloop working this same stretch of coast specifically hunting vessels matching your description. That kind of detail, specific, uncertain, requiring judgment and follow-up questions rather than a fixed yes or no answer, simply couldn't travel by flag or gunshot. It needed a human being, rowing across open water, willing to say the actual words out loud and answer whatever questions came back. Ned returned an hour later, with word that the consort's captain wanted to move anchorage before dawn, information that 100 flags could never have carried with the same nuance, delivered instead by 4 tired men with blistered hands and a small boat that had, for one afternoon, been the fastest and most reliable communication technology either crew possessed. There's something worth sitting with in that, a small, specific kind of wonder easy to miss underneath the danger and the missing fingers and the general grimness of the whole enterprise. 2 crews of armed strangers, most of them coerced into their positions one way or another, had built a communication system entirely out of cloth, lantern light, and mutual trust in a plan agreed on days in advance, and it had worked, across a storm, across 5 days of silence, across 40 miles of open, indifferent ocean. No radio has ever done anything more impressive than that, honestly. It just does it faster. Everything a modern ship accomplishes in the time it takes to key a microphone, this crew had accomplished across 5 silent days and 40 miles of open ocean, using nothing but agreements made calmly in a harbour that by the time the storm hit was already weeks behind you. Signals across open water solved one kind of problem, but long before a pirate crew ever needed to find a consort ship again, they needed somewhere to go in the first place. A fixed point on an unreliable ocean that every pirate captain in the region could trust would still be there, still welcoming, still exactly where they'd left it. In late July of 1718, a small squadron of ships approached the harbour at New Providence Island in the Bahamas, and the man standing at the rail of the lead vessel, a newly appointed governor named Woodes Rogers, would have seen something almost no other English colonial official of his era had ever laid eyes on. A harbour crowded with pirate sloops. Dozens of them by most contemporary estimates, anchored openly, flags flying, crews going about their business with the casual confidence of men who had never once had to hide. Rogers carried with him a printed copy of the King's proclamation, offering pardon to any pirate willing to surrender, and he carried, too, whatever private doubts a reasonable man might carry sailing into a harbour that had functioned, for the better part of a decade, as the closest thing piracy ever had to a capital city. The smell of the place would have reached him before the details did. Tar and rendered turtle fat and the specific rot of too many hulls, left too long without proper careening. Drifting out over water thick with small boats ferrying goods between anchored ships and a shoreline crowded with makeshift huts. Canvas awnings stretched between salvaged timber. Cookfires sending up thin columns of smoke that from a distance might almost have looked peaceful. Rogers had commanded merchant convoys and privateering voyages across 2 oceans by this point in his career, had circumnavigated the globe once already, and by his own later account, nothing in that considerable experience had fully prepared him for the sight of a harbour this openly. Unapologetically given over to men the Crown had spent years and a considerable fortune trying to hang. He was, by trade and temperament, a man who understood logistics, supply lines, the movement of ships and cargo across enormous distances with only the crudest tools available for coordinating any of it. Even so, the sheer scale of what he found waiting for him, an entire improvised settlement built from the same basic instinct that let 2 ships find each other after a storm, only multiplied across 1,000 men and a decade of accumulated habit, must have registered as something genuinely unprecedented. A kind of communication infrastructure nobody in London had ever formally authorised, and nobody in Nassau had ever needed to. This is the story of Nassau, the one fixed point on an otherwise unpredictable ocean that solved a communication problem no flag or lantern ever could. Every system covered so far in tonight's journey. The flags, the signal guns, the lanterns strung along a dark rail, worked across distances of 1 mile or 2, sometimes less. None of them could tell a pirate captain 300 miles away where to find allies, where to sell a captured cargo, or where to simply be safe for a season. Nassau solved that problem by removing the need for real-time communication entirely. It didn't matter that no message could travel fast enough to coordinate 2 ships on opposite sides of the Caribbean. Everyone already knew where Nassau was. A fixed location, once its reputation had spread, functioned as a message that never needed sending twice. The harbour's usefulness to pirates traces back to a piece of bad luck for its original English colonists. During Queen Anne's War, the prolonged conflict between England and a Franco-Spanish alliance that ran from 1702 to 1713, New Providence's small settlement was raided and largely destroyed, first by the French and Spanish in 1703, and again in the years that followed, leaving the island's formal governance in ruins and its English colonial administration effectively absent for well over a decade. Nobody rebuilt it in any official capacity. No governor sat in residence enforcing English law. What remained was simply the geography, a genuinely excellent natural harbour, shallow enough near its approaches to keep out the deeper draft warships a navy might otherwise send in pursuit, yet deep enough in its main channel to comfortably hold the shallow sloops pirates, favoured for exactly this kind of coastal work. A power vacuum and useful geography, combined, produced something that no single person ever planned or announced. It simply accumulated, the way the flag codes in earlier chapters accumulated, one arriving crew at a time. Word of an unpoliced, defensible harbour with a serviceable careening beach travels fast among sailors, faster still among sailors, with strong incentives to remember exactly where it is. By the early 1710s, a rotating population of pirates, estimated by various contemporary accounts and later historians at somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 men at the settlement's peak, around 1716 and 1717, had turned Nassau into what the modern historian Colin Woodard would later popularise as the Republic of Pirates, a phrase that captures something real even if the settlement never had anything resembling a formal government, constitution, or elected leadership beyond whatever loose authority a handful of prominent captains carried by reputation alone. Among the earliest and most influential of these was Benjamin Hornigold, whose loose confederation of allied crews became known, somewhat theatrically, as the Flying Gang, a group that at various points included men who would go on to become considerably more famous than Hornigold himself, Edward Teach chief among them, reportedly serving under Hornigold's informal command before striking out with his own ship and eventually his own considerable reputation. What made Nassau function as a communication system rather than simply a hideout was its permanence, or at least its apparent permanence, which for this purpose amounted to the same thing. A pirate captain planning a voyage from, say, the waters off Virginia could reasonably assume that whatever allies, buyers, or simple company he might need would eventually pass through the same harbour he was heading toward, without either party needing to send word ahead. Ships separated by storm, by a failed rendezvous elsewhere, by simple bad luck, and worse navigation, could still expect to eventually cross paths in Nassau's harbour, because Nassau wasn't going anywhere. This is worth pausing on, because it inverts how communication usually gets thought about. Most of the systems covered tonight, the flags, the lanterns, the signal guns, moved information across space in real time. Nassau moved information across time instead. A fixed answer to the question, "Where will I find you?" that remained valid for years, without ever needing to be updated or repeated. The settlement that grew up around this arrangement was, by most surviving accounts, a genuinely strange place to actually live, something between a boomtown and a refugee camp, built mostly from salvaged ships' timber and captured canvas, its population swelling and shrinking with the arrival and departure of individual crews. There was no formal court, no consistent law beyond whatever a given ship's articles specified for its own crew, and no permanent authority capable of enforcing order across the whole settlement at once, which occasionally produced exactly the kind of chaos you'd expect from several hundred armed men, with disposable prize money and few consequences for spending it badly. And yet it also, by several accounts, developed its own rough customs over time, an informal etiquette around trading captured goods, around which crews owed favours to which others, around whose reputation could be trusted and whose couldn't, a social fabric assembled the same improvised way the flag codes had been, agreement by agreement, without a single overseeing authority ever writing the rules down in one place. One of the clearest illustrations of Nassau's power as a gathering point, rather than simply a hideout, comes from events that predate the settlement's peak years, but helped establish exactly the reputation that drew so many pirates there in the first place. In 1715, a Spanish treasure fleet, sailing from Havana bound for Spain, was wrecked in a hurricane along the Florida coast, scattering an enormous quantity of silver across shallow water that Spanish salvage crews spent months painstakingly recovering and stockpiling in guarded camps ashore. Word of this reached men like Henry Jennings, then operating out of Jamaica and soon to become one of Nassau's founding figures, through exactly the kind of informal, second-hand maritime gossip network this whole chapter has been describing. Sailors talking to sailors, ships passing news at anchor, rumour moving from port to port faster than any official channel could suppress it. Jennings organised a raid on the Spanish salvage camp itself in early 1716, making off with a substantial haul of recovered silver without ever engaging a single Spanish treasure ship at sea, an act of piracy that succeeded entirely because information about where the silver was, unguarded and stockpiled, had travelled through informal channels quickly enough to be acted on before Spanish. Authorities could properly secure it. Jennings brought his prize back toward New Providence, and the success of that raid, retold and embellished countless times over rum in the months that followed, did more to cement Nassau's reputation as the place where a pirate crew could actually profit than any single flag or proclamation ever managed. That reputation, once established, created its own kind of economy, one that extended well beyond the harbour itself and pulled in participants who never set foot on a pirate deck at all. Merchants operating out of colonial ports as far away as New York and Charleston maintained quiet, deniable trading relationships with Nassau's pirate population throughout this period, exchanging manufactured goods, gunpowder and provisions for captured cargo sold at a steep discount, no questions asked on either side. This trade required its own communication, of course arrangements made through trusted intermediaries, coded references in private letters, and a great deal of mutual self-interested silence, since a colonial merchant caught trading openly with known pirates risked serious legal consequences even in an era when enforcement was often more theoretical than actual. The result was a genuinely strange economic network, part black market, part open secret, stretching from a lawless Bahamian harbour all the way up the American coast, held together not by any single message or messenger, but by dozens of separate mutually reinforcing relationships that everyone involved had strong incentives to keep functioning smoothly and quietly. Charles Vane, one of the more notoriously defiant captains to call Nassau home during this period, would go on to provide one of the sharpest illustrations of what happened when this entire fragile system collided with actual royal authority. But before that collision, Nassau simply worked, quietly, for years, as exactly the kind of rendezvous point covered in the previous chapter, except scaled up from 2 ships agreeing on a beach to an entire ocean's worth of pirates agreeing, without ever formally agreeing to anything, on a single harbour. By 1717, English authorities had grown sufficiently alarmed by piracy's toll on Atlantic trade that King George I issued a formal proclamation, commonly referred to since as the Act of Grace, offering pardon to any pirate who surrendered to colonial authorities by a specified date. What makes this proclamation relevant to tonight's subject isn't its legal content so much as its method of delivery, because a royal pardon, unlike a flag hoisted at a foremast, had to reach an audience that was, by definition, scattered across thousands of miles of ocean with no fixed address and no reliable way to be individually notified. The solution colonial authorities settled on amounted to a form of mass broadcast built entirely out of period technology, printed copies of the proclamation distributed to colonial newspapers up and down the American coast and across Caribbean ports, read aloud in taverns and public squares, copied by hand and passed along personal networks until, eventually, through sheer redundant repetition, the message reached the one audience that mattered, even though nobody could have addressed it directly. It was slow, it was unreliable, dependent entirely on which ships happened to carry which newspapers to which ports in what order. But it worked. Eventually, the same way water eventually finds every low point in a landscape given enough time. News of the proclamation itself had actually reached Nassau months before Rogers's own ships appeared on the horizon, carried there the same second-hand way most information reached the settlement, aboard merchant vessels and captured prizes whose crews brought printed copies, or more often, garbled verbal summaries of what the king was apparently offering. Accounts from the period suggest the pardon's arrival triggered exactly the kind of prolonged, contentious debate you'd expect from a population with no formal leadership and every reason to distrust official promises. Some captains, Hornigold reportedly among the more receptive, saw a genuine opportunity to retire from an increasingly dangerous trade, while the offer still stood. Others suspected a trap, reasoning, not unreasonably, that a crown which had spent years hunting them down had little obvious incentive to suddenly forgive the whole enterprise without some catch buried in the fine print. There was no single meeting, no formal vote across the whole settlement, nothing resembling the orderly process a single pirate crew used to settle matters under its own articles. Instead, the decision fractured along exactly the lines you'd expect from a population held together by nothing more than shared geography and mutual convenience, some prepared to surrender, some prepared to fight. And a great many simply waited to see which choice looked wiser once actual ships carrying the actual offer finally showed up in the harbour. Woodes Rogers arrived to enforce exactly this proclamation in person, backed by several Royal Navy vessels and a Bahamas governorship carrying real, if newly reasserted, legal authority. The scene that reportedly greeted him in Nassau's harbour that July, dozens of pirate vessels at anchor, crews uncertain whether to fight, flee, or actually take the pardon being offered, represents one of the clearest turning points in the entire Golden Age of Piracy. The moment the fixed, dependable rendezvous point that had functioned for over a decade suddenly stopped being safe. Several hundred pirates reportedly did take the pardon in the weeks that followed, formally surrendering their arms and, at least on paper, their profession, choosing an uncertain peace over an increasingly dangerous trade. Not everyone did. Charles Vane, rather than surrender, reportedly sent a captured vessel, deliberately loaded and set alight, drifting toward Rogers's anchored fleet as a parting act of defiance, forcing several of the governor's own ships to scramble and cut their anchor cables to avoid the flames in the crowded harbour. In the confusion that followed, Vane's own sloop slipped out through the harbour's mouth under full sail, past ships that should, by any reasonable expectation, have been positioned to stop him, flying his colours the entire way out and, according to more than one account of the episode, firing a final defiant shot back toward the harbour as the gap widened behind him. It's a genuinely dramatic exit, the kind of scene that reads almost too neatly as theatre, and it's worth remembering that most surviving descriptions of it come down to a second-hand and after the fact, the same way so much of this era's detail does. But the broad shape of the event, a burning ship, a scrambled fleet, and one captain sailing calmly out the front door while the king's own governor and his warships failed to stop him, appears consistently enough across independent accounts that the core of it seems solid, whatever embellishment gathered around the edges in the retelling. It's a genuinely dramatic exit, and it's tempting to read it as simple recklessness, but it also says something honest about what Nassau had actually meant to men like Vane. Not just a hideout, a kind of home, however strange and lawless a home it was, and one Vane apparently preferred to defend rather than abandon, even against odds that would eventually catch up with him regardless. Blackbeard, for his part, reportedly accepted the pardon not long after, only to drift back toward piracy within a matter of months, a pattern several former Nassau residents seem to have followed, the pardon functioning less like a permanent off-ramp and more like a temporary pause button for men who had few other trades to fall back on, and, in some cases, few other places they still felt they belonged. Anne Bonny and Mary Read, two of the era's most enduringly famous pirates, precisely because they were women serving openly aboard an armed vessel in a profession assumed at the time to be exclusively male, both spent time in and around Nassau's orbit during these years, Bonny reportedly meeting Calico Jack Rackham there before the two of them. Along with Read, went on to a career that would end in a Jamaican courtroom in 1720. Their documented trial record, one of the more reliable surviving sources from this whole era, precisely because it comes from actual court proceedings rather than Johnson's embellished retelling, confirms at minimum that both women were present, armed, and fighting at the moment of their capture, whatever additional colour later writers added around the edges. Nassau's role in their story is a smaller detail in a much larger one, but it illustrates something worth noting. The harbour didn't just gather ships and cargo. It gathered people, entire biographies that might otherwise never have intersected, brought together by nothing more coordinated than a shared destination everyone happened to already know. Nassau never fully recovered its old role after 1718. Rogers stayed, fortified the harbour, and gradually turned the settlement into something closer to an ordinary, if still rough, colonial town, and the pirates who didn't take the pardon or didn't stay pardoned scattered toward other, less permanent hiding places along the American coast and further out into the Atlantic. But for roughly a decade, a single harbour with no government, no formal law, and no reliable way for any one pirate to contact any other, had nonetheless functioned as one of the most effective communication systems the entire era produced. Not by sending messages faster, but by giving an entire scattered, lawless population one fixed point they could all, independently, agree to trust. Modern historians, Colin Woodard's widely read 2007 account chief among them, have spent considerable effort reconstructing exactly how this brief, unlikely settlement functioned. Piecing the story together from colonial correspondence, trial records, and the scattered, often unreliable secondary accounts that survive from the period. Precisely because so little was ever written down by the pirates themselves at the time. This reconstruction work matters more than it might seem, because it's the only real corrective available against the same embellishing pull that reshaped so much of this era's history, the temptation, present in every retelling from Johnson onward, to smooth and untidy, contradictory settlement into a cleaner story than it likely ever was. Modern Nassau, now a substantial city and a popular cruise destination, retains almost nothing physically visible from this era beyond a handful of place names and a tourism industry happy to lean on the association. But the underlying idea Nassau represented, that are fixed. Shared destination can function as a communication system in its own right, that you don't always need a message to travel if everyone already knows where to go, turns out to be a remarkably durable piece of logistics, one that outlasted the pirates who first relied on it by several centuries and counting. Not every message a pirate crew needed arrived by flag, by lantern, or by the accumulated reputation of a single famous harbour. Sometimes the fastest way to learn anything useful about the ocean around you was to stop the nearest ship you could find and simply ask. The rope creaks under your weight before your feet even find the deck, that particular groan of hemp under strain that you've come to associate less with danger and more with the specific, focused calm that settles over a boarding party in the seconds before contact. Smoke still hangs in the air from the warning shot fired minutes earlier, sharp and sulphurous, and underneath it you catch the ordinary smell of someone else's ship, different tar, different cargo, a whiff of salted fish from somewhere below that tells you more about this vessel's trade than anyone's said a word yet. You're part of the boarding party today, cutlass in hand more for show than expectation, because this particular merchant captain struck his colours the moment your ship's black flag went up, exactly the way the whole system covered earlier tonight was designed to work. What happens next isn't really about the cargo, or at least not only about the cargo. It's about the questions. Your quartermaster, a broad, unhurried man everyone calls Silas, has already found the merchant captain and begun the part of this encounter that mattered just as much as any hold full of sugar or rum, extracting news. A newly captured ship wasn't just a source of loot. It was, in an age with no faster way to move information, one of the single richest sources of current intelligence a pirate crew could hope to encounter. A vessel that had until minutes ago been sailing freely through waters you couldn't access nearly as openly, carrying knowledge of ports, prices, patrols and rumours that were, by the standards of the day, remarkably fresh. By your third boarding of the voyage, you've learned the actual shape of this interrogation, because it follows a pattern almost as consistent as the flag code from Chapter 1. Silas starts friendly, almost conversational, less because he's a gentle man, he isn't particularly, and more because a frightened captain who believes cooperation might spare his ship additional damage tends to talk more freely than one who's simply being threatened. Where are you bound and where from comes first, establishing the basic shape of the voyage. Then, almost as an afterthought, the questions that actually mattered. Any naval vessels sighted recently, and where? Any word of other pirates working these waters, friend or rival? What prices were goods fetching in the last port visited? Information with real practical value for deciding what to do with whatever cargo you'd just taken. The captain today, a heavy-set sweating man named Pemberton by his own ship's papers, answered everything asked of him with the particular thoroughness of a man hoping thoroughness might be rewarded with an intact ship once you'd finished. You'd learned, too, that a captured captain's tone mattered nearly as much as his words. Pemberton, for all his sweating thoroughness, kept his voice steady throughout, which Silas seemed to take as a small mark in his favour, a man frightened but not so far gone into panic that his account couldn't be trusted. A captain who couldn't stop his voice from shaking, by contrast, tended to have his answers double-checked more aggressively. Cross-referenced against whatever the crew or the ship's papers seemed to confirm independently, since fear this consuming had a way of producing exaggeration in both directions, threats inflated or minimised depending on whatever the frightened man imagined might end the encounter soonest. Standing near Silas through most of this exchange was a quiet, watchful man named Kofi, who joined the crew 8 months earlier after the slave ship transporting him was taken off the West African coast, and who had chosen, when given the choice that pirate crews of this era genuinely extended in at least some documented cases, to sign the ship's articles as a full member rather than simply be set ashore or transferred to whatever fate awaited him otherwise. He carried a full share under those articles, the same vote in ship's decisions as any other man aboard, and a working knowledge of 4 languages picked up across a life that had, by the time he reached your deck, already crossed more water than most sailors managed in a full career. His job during a boarding wasn't fighting. Mostly, it was listening. Catching the details a frightened captain let slip in a language he assumed his captors didn't understand, then relaying, quietly, whatever seemed worth Silas knowing. It rarely was, not fully, though Silas seemed to genuinely weigh what Pemberton offered against what the crew actually needed before deciding how much of the cargo to take, and how much to leave behind for the man's continued voyage. This is worth sitting with for a moment. The interrogation wasn't purely extractive violence, whatever else it involved. It functioned in a strange and uncomfortable way as a transaction, information and cooperation traded against the severity of what followed, an economy of intelligence layered directly on top of the more obvious economy of stolen cargo. Here's what made this particular form of intelligence gathering so valuable, and so different from the fixed rendezvous points or the prearranged signal codes covered earlier tonight. It was current in a way almost nothing else available to a pirate crew could be. A rendezvous point like Nassau told you where things had reliably been for years. A captured captain, questioned within hours of leaving his last port, could tell you what was happening right now, or at least as close to right now as any information moved in an age without faster transportation than the fastest ship available. Pemberton, it turned out, had left Kingston 6 days earlier, and Kingston, he reported, still buzzing with fresh talk of a Royal Navy sloop that had put in for repairs after apparently engaging another pirate vessel somewhere off Hispaniola. 6 days old, filtered through a frightened merchant captain's memory and his understandable desire to seem helpful, and still it was the freshest piece of naval intelligence your crew had received in over 2 weeks at sea. Pemberton's own cargo manifest, once Silas had finished with him and handed the papers off for a proper reading, turned out to be its own small education in the economics of the trade you'd joined. 42 hogsheads of sugar, valued by the manifest's own figures at somewhere near £2 10 shillings per hundredweight in Kingston, alongside a smaller quantity of rum and a strong box holding a little over £80 in coin, the kind of cargo that, once sold quietly through the sort of trading relationships covered in the previous chapter, could translate into real, meaningful money for every man aboard once shares were divided according to the articles. But the manifest told you more than a simple total. It told you what a Kingston merchant was currently willing to pay, information considerably fresher than anything a rendezvous point or a months-old rumour could offer, and information that would directly shape where your quartermaster chose to sell the sugar rather than the rum first. You'd learn, over the following months, that ship's papers themselves carried nearly as much value as anything the captain said aloud. A cargo manifest told you exactly what a ship carried, and by extension, what it was likely worth, sparing everyone the trouble of a full inventory search through cramped holds. A ship's log, when captains hadn't had the foresight to throw it overboard before surrendering, which some did and some, in the panic of the moment, simply forgot, could reveal an entire voyage's worth of recorded sightings, weather and encounters, effectively handing you weeks of someone else's careful observation for the cost of nothing more than finding the right drawer in the captain's cabin. Personal letters. Correspondence a captain or passenger carried for delivery in the next port. Occasionally contain news of a more social kind, which merchant houses were struggling, which colonial governors had fallen out of favour, gossip that meant little to a fighting man, but a great deal to a quartermaster trying to judge where a stolen cargo might fetch its best price. By the time your ship had taken its 8th or 9th prize of the season, you'd started to understand something about this whole system that hadn't been obvious at the start. Every captured ship functioned, in effect as a small involuntary newspaper, delivered directly to your deck with no subscription required beyond a willingness to fire a warning shot and wait for the colours to come down. It was unreliable in the way any single source is unreliable, coloured by fear, self-interest, and simple human error. But it was also fast, current, and delivered in enough volume across enough separate encounters that patterns started to emerge. 3 different captured captains in the same month, mentioning the same naval sloop working the same stretch of coast, wasn't proof of anything by naval standards, but it was enough for a cautious quartermaster to start adjusting his planned route. This kind of linguistic range wasn't unusual among pirate crews of the era, whatever the popular image of a uniformly English-speaking band of cutthroats might suggest. Crews assembled from captured merchant sailors, escaped or freed enslaved people, and deserters from half a dozen different national navies tended, almost by necessity, to end up considerably more multilingual than the merchant ships they preyed on, a practical byproduct of forced recruitment that occasionally paid unexpected dividends exactly like this one. Kofi's particular skill mattered most, and most visibly, roughly a month after the Pemberton boarding, when your ship overtook a Portuguese trading vessel whose captain spoke no English at all and whose crew, understandably, offered nothing but frightened silence to Silas's usual round of questions. Silas, for all his practiced menace, had no Portuguese, and for several genuinely tense minutes the entire interrogation stalled completely, a wall of mutual incomprehension that no amount of implied threat could push through on its own. Kofi stepped forward, spoke a few careful sentences, and watched the Portuguese captain's shoulders drop half an inch. The specific, visible relief of a frightened man realizing he could finally be understood. What followed was, by your reckoning, the most productive interrogation you'd witnessed all season, not because the questions changed, but because the answers, finally, could actually be heard and trusted rather than guessed at through gesture and tone alone. The captain reported, among other things, that a squadron of Spanish Guardacosta vessels, ships tasked with protecting Spanish shipping and hunting exactly your kind of crew, had been sighted working the waters south of your current position not 4 days earlier. Information that reshaped your course for the following week, and that nobody aboard would have received at all without Kofi standing exactly where he stood. Not every boarding went as smoothly as Pemberton's did, and by your 5th month aboard, you'd learned exactly how differently things could unfold when a captured crew decided cooperation wasn't worth the trouble. A Dutch merchantman taken off the Leeward Islands produced a captain who answered every question with practiced, infuriating vagueness, claiming to know nothing of naval movements, nothing of other pirates, nothing beyond the immediate business of his own cargo. A performance Silas seemed to recognize instantly for what it was. What happened next wasn't described in any of the ship's articles you'd signed, and it isn't something worth lingering over here except to say that fear proved, as it usually did, a more reliable extraction tool than patience, and that the Dutch captain's story changed considerably within the hour. There's little pride to be taken in that particular fact. And the crew, by your reading of the mood on deck afterward, seemed to take none. It was simply how the system worked when the friendlier version failed to produce results. You noticed, afterward, that nobody lingered below decks longer than duty required. That conversation on deck that evening stayed quieter and more clipped than usual, and that even Silas, not a man given to visible discomfort, spent a longer stretch than normal standing alone at the rail before finally coming below to eat. Whatever this system cost in information gained, it clearly cost something else too. Something none of the ship's articles had a line item for. What happens below decks during an unfriendly interrogation is not, admittedly, the most restful subject to dwell on, so let's leave it there and return instead to a gentler kind of information exchange, one that didn't require a warning shot at all. Not every ship you approached needed boarding to talk. Small fishing boats, coastal traders, and other vessels too poor or too insignificant to bother robbing outright were sometimes simply hailed, questioned and released, an entirely voluntary exchange, particularly from crews who'd learned that a friendly pirate ship asking for news was considerably preferable to an unfriendly one demanding cargo. These encounters produced some of your crew's most reliable intelligence precisely because nobody involved had any particular incentive to lie. A fisherman with nothing worth stealing had no reason to withhold what he'd genuinely seen, and more than one captain over the following weeks made a point of hailing exactly this kind of small, harmless vessel purely for the news it might carry. Cargo be damned. There's a quieter moment worth setting down here too, one that had nothing directly to do with intelligence gathering, but everything to do with why a man like Kofi chose to stay aboard a crew he could, at multiple points along the way, have simply left. During the Portuguese boarding, a cabin boy no older than 11 had frozen entirely, too frightened to answer even the gentlest question, and it was Kofi, not Silas, who crouched down to the boy's eye level and spoke to him softly in Portuguese for a full minute before the boy managed a single word. Nobody ordered him to do that. It wasn't part of the interrogation, and it cost the crew nothing to skip it entirely. He did it anyway. Later that same evening, over the crew's evening ration, one of the younger hands asked Kofi outright why he'd stayed aboard after the ship that first took him. Why sign articles with the very men who'd have profited from selling him just as readily as freeing him? His answer, as it was later recounted, was simple and unsentimental aboard this ship. He held the same vote as any man on it in choosing the captain, the same share in whatever the crew took, the same claim to compensation if he lost a limb in the taking of it. Nowhere else on the ocean, in 1719, could he say the same with any confidence at all. It wasn't loyalty exactly, and nobody aboard mistook it for that. It was a contract, freely entered, that happened to treat him better than almost anything else available to him at the time, and that was its own kind of answer. Sometimes the intelligence walked straight into your lap without a single question needing to be asked. 9 months into your time aboard, a small trading sloop struck her colours without so much as a warning shot fired, her captain practically shouting news across the closing gap before your boat had even touched her deck. A royal pardon, he said, offered to any pirate willing to surrender by a set date, already being read aloud in ports up and down the coast. This was, of course, the same act of grace that would eventually send Woodes Rogers sailing into Nassau's harbour, and for your crew. Months before any of that unfolded, the news arrived exactly the way most important news arrived out here. Second-hand, breathless, and delivered by a man who had every incentive to make himself useful to the pirates currently boarding his ship. Half your crew treated the news as an obvious trick. The other half spent that evening quietly doing arithmetic about how much prize money they'd need before the deadline to make retirement worth considering. Nobody aboard fully believed a word of it yet, and nobody aboard could quite stop talking about it either, which is roughly how most genuinely important news tends to land, whether it arrives by royal proclamation or by a frightened merchant captain hoping honesty might buy him an easier afternoon. Not every captain proved so forthcoming, and not every ship's log survived long enough to be read. More than one captured captain, in the panicked minutes before boarding actually began, made straight for his own logbook and pitched it over the side rather than let it fall into pirate hands, a small, almost petty act of resistance that nonetheless cost your crew a genuinely valuable source of intelligence every time it succeeded. Silas took this personally, in the specific way a man takes personally anything that denies him information he considers rightfully his by conquest, and crews had been known to search a captured vessel considerably more thoroughly and considerably less gently after discovering a missing log than they might have otherwise. There's something almost comic about it, if you squint, the pirate version of an author burning their own diary rather than let a stranger read it, except here the diary in question might have contained the location of a Royal Navy patrol capable of ending your entire crew's career rather than merely an embarrassing adolescent confession. By season's end, roughly a year into this particular voyage, the crew had taken somewhere close to 24 prizes, and the pattern across every single one of them had held remarkably steady. Cargo mattered, obviously it was the whole practical point of the enterprise, but the news mattered nearly as much, layered on top of every boarding like an invisible second cargo hold, one that couldn't be spent in port but that shaped, more than almost anything else available to the crew, which direction the ship actually sailed next. By the season's end, the sheer accumulated volume of second-hand, third-hand and occasionally fourth-hand news your crew had gathered this way, ship's papers, frightened confessions, casual gossip from fishermen with nothing to hide, amounted to something genuinely remarkable when you stop to consider it. An entire working intelligence network, built with no formal structure, no dedicated agents, and no method faster than a ship's own hull moving through water. And yet one that kept your crew reasonably well informed about a fast-changing, genuinely dangerous world. It wasn't accurate the way a modern intelligence service aims for accuracy. It was noisy, contradictory, and coloured constantly by fear and self-interest on every side of every exchange. But it was, for its time, remarkably effective, built entirely out of the oldest communication technology available to anyone, one frightened person talking to another. Because the alternative to talking had just fired a warning shot across their bow. No signal book, no flag code, no fixed rendezvous point could have delivered news this current, this specific, or this personal. And it's worth remembering the next time this particular era gets reduced to nothing but cutlasses and buried treasure, that a genuinely enormous share of what kept a pirate crew alive from one month to the next came down to something as simple and as human as two frightened strangers finding a way to talk to each other across the width of a captured deck. News gathered ship by ship was one thing. Sometimes, though, a pirate crew didn't have to wait for a captured captain to volunteer information at all, because an entire city, held hostage in the most literal sense, could be made to hand over exactly what was demanded. On the morning of May 22nd, 1718, a pilot boat working the entrance to Charleston Harbour, the vessel whose job was guiding incoming ships safely past the sandbars that made the approach genuinely treacherous for anyone unfamiliar with the channel, found itself suddenly surrounded by a small squadron flying no colours it recognised as friendly. Within the hour, the pilot boat had been taken, its crew held, and word had begun spreading through the town itself that something considerably worse than an ordinary robbery had just arrived off the coast. By the time the sun set that evening, a merchant ship called the Crowley, inbound from London and carrying among her passengers a prominent member of the colony's governing council named Samuel Wragg, had also been stopped and boarded, her passengers taken as prisoners rather than simply relieved of their cargo. Charleston, a town of perhaps 3,000 residents at the time, one of the wealthiest and most important ports in Britain's American colonies, had just become a hostage to a man the world would remember as Blackbeard. Over the days that followed, additional vessels attempting the same harbour approach met the same fate, among them, by several surviving accounts, a ship simply recorded as bound outward from Charleston with a cargo of provisions, and another inbound from the northern colonies carrying passengers who found themselves, with no warning at all, suddenly transformed from ordinary travellers into leverage in a negotiation they had no part in starting. This is the story of the week. An entire city went quiet, held hostage not by cannon fire or invasion, but by a demand that had to travel entirely on foot, carried by messengers rowing back and forth across water that no flag, no signal gun, and no rendezvous point could bridge on its own. Everything covered so far in tonight's journey involved communication between ships or between a fixed point and whoever knew to look for it. Charleston represents something different, a pirate squadron negotiating directly with an entire town, using the oldest, slowest, most nerve-wracking communication method available, a human being, sent ashore, trusted to carry a message and, everyone hoped, trusted to come back. Word of what had happened to the pilot boat reached the town itself well before any official report could, carried the same way most urgent news moved through a colonial port, by whoever happened to see it first, running or riding to tell whoever would listen. A dock worker who'd watched the pilot boat's capture from shore told a fisherman, who told a merchant's clerk, who told the merchant himself, and within hours a version of events, garbled in the retelling the way any story passed through 4 separate mouths tends to get garbled, had spread through Charleston's taverns and wharves faster than any official notice could have managed. By the time the Crowley was taken later that same day, confirming that whatever waited offshore was neither a rumour nor an isolated incident, the town had already worked itself into a state bordering on panic, shops shuttering early. Families with relatives aboard inbound ships gathering at the harbour's edge for news that, for the moment, nobody on land actually possessed. Rumour, in the absence of anything more reliable, filled every gap it could reach. And by nightfall half the town believed the pirate fleet offshore numbered several times its actual size. By May of 1718, Edward Teach had already spent roughly 2 years building the reputation that would outlive him by 3 centuries, operating a small fleet that at its peak included his flagship, a converted former French slave ship he'd captured and renamed Queen Anne's Revenge, mounting somewhere in the range of 40 guns by most period estimates, along with several smaller sloops sailing in consort, exactly the kind of coordinated squadron covered in an earlier chapter of tonight's journey. Charleston represented a considerably more ambitious target than the individual merchant ships his crew usually took. rather than intercept vessels one at a time on the open ocean. Teach positioned his squadron directly across the harbour's narrow entrance channel, effectively sealing the port itself. A tactic that required far less searching and far more patience than his usual method. Since Charleston's own geography, its harbour bottlenecked by sandbars that forced every inbound and outbound ship through the same narrow approach, did most of the actual work for him. Charleston's own geography made this particular tactic almost absurdly effective for a squadron of Teach's modest size, and it's worth understanding exactly why. Because it says something about how little actual force a blockade required if you chose your ground correctly. The harbour's approach ran through a narrow, shifting channel bordered on both sides by sandbars treacherous enough that experienced local pilots made their entire living guiding unfamiliar captains safely through. A natural bottleneck that meant Teach's ships didn't need to patrol a wide stretch of open coastline at all. They simply needed to sit across one relatively narrow doorway and wait for the town's entire maritime trade to walk directly into them. A modern comparison might be parking a single car across the only on-ramp to a highway, rather than trying to chase down every vehicle already out on the road, considerably less effort for a comparable, if not greater, degree of disruption. Over the course of roughly a week, Teach's squadron reportedly stopped somewhere between 8 and 9 vessels attempting to enter or leave the harbour. An economic stranglehold on one of the wealthiest ports in British America, achieved with a handful of ships and considerably less violence than the situation's reputation might suggest. Most of these captured vessels were relieved of cargo and eventually released standard practice for the era. The Crowley, and the presence aboard her of a man with genuine political standing in the colony, changed the calculation entirely. Rag wasn't simply a wealthy passenger, he was a sitting member of the Governor's Council, a man whose captivity meant Teach now held, in effect. A direct line to the colonial government itself, something no amount of ordinary robbery could have purchased. Samuel Rag himself, by his own later account given to colonial authorities, spent his captivity aboard ship in a state he described as constant, low-grade dread, punctuated by moments of genuine terror whenever Teach's mood seemed to darken, which, given the mounting delay in his own men's return from shore, happened with increasing frequency as the week wore on. Rag was, by every account, a man of genuine standing and comfort in Charleston society, entirely unaccustomed to the particular helplessness of being a bargaining chip in a negotiation he had no power to influence, confined to a captured ship's deck or hold. Entirely dependent on the good faith of men on land he couldn't see and messengers he couldn't hurry along. It's worth pausing on the specific, ordinary humanity of that fear. Rag wasn't a soldier, wasn't a sailor by trade, wasn't anyone who had signed up for this kind of risk, the way a merchant crew at least implicitly accepted when they took to the sea in an era of piracy. He was simply a passenger, on the wrong ship, on the wrong week, and for several days his continued survival rested entirely on the speed of a rowboat, and the patience of a man whose patience had already run out more than once that year. The demand Teach sent ashore was, by the standards of piracy in this era, almost startlingly specific and almost entirely non-monetary. Rather than gold, rather than an outright ransom paid in coin, Teach requested a chest of medicine, valued by various period accounts at somewhere in the neighbourhood of £300 to £400 sterling. A genuinely significant sum for medical supplies in 1718, though a modest one compared to what a wealthy councilman's life might otherwise have commanded on the open market of hostage-taking. Historians have offered a few different explanations for why medicine specifically, ranging from a straightforward outbreak of illness aboard his own ships, plausible enough given the cramped, unsanitary conditions any vessel of this era carried as a matter of course, to a more calculated read that medical supplies was simply easier for a colonial government to justify handing over without appearing to directly fund piracy the way an outright cash payment might. Whatever the precise motive, the demand itself had to travel from ship to shore the same way every piece of information in this chapter did, carried by a person, rowed across open water, delivered by voice or by written note to officials, who then had to decide, under genuine time pressure, whether they believed the threat was real. The men Teach sent ashore to deliver this demand were placed in a position that, from a purely logistical standpoint, illustrates just how fragile ship-to-shore negotiation genuinely was in an age with no faster method available. There was no way for Teach to simply wait offshore and receive an answer by any means faster than the boat's own return journey. No way to check in partway through. No way to know, once his men disappeared into a town controlled by people who had every reason to want them dead, whether they were negotiating on his behalf or already in chains. The entire arrangement rested on trust extended in both directions at once. Teach trusting his own men to actually deliver the message and return, Charleston's officials trusting that failing to respond, or responding with force instead of cooperation, would genuinely endanger Rag and the other hostages still held aboard ship. There's a specific, almost absurd detail buried in several accounts of the messenger's delay that's worth including precisely because it undercuts the high drama of the situation with exactly the kind of dry, human inconvenience that actual history tends to produce more often than legend does. At least part of the hold-up, by some period accounts, came down to simple colonial bureaucracy, officials needing to locate and assemble the specific medicines requested from apothecaries scattered across a town that had, understandably, half-panicked and partially shut its own commerce down in response to the very crisis those medicines were meant to resolve. It's the 18th century equivalent of being placed on hold during an actual emergency, and it's a genuinely uncomfortable thought that a hostage's life may have hinged, in part, on how quickly a Charleston apothecary could locate the right stock on his shelves. What followed, according to the clearest surviving accounts, was several days of mounting tension that had almost nothing to do with cannon fire and everything to do with the agonizing slowness of the negotiation itself. Teach's messengers once ashore encountered delays, whether from simple bureaucratic friction, deliberate stalling by wary colonial officials, or some combination of both isn't entirely clear from the surviving record. Teach, waiting offshore with his hostages and no faster way to learn what was actually happening in the town beyond his line of sight, grew increasingly convinced his men had been detained or killed, and by most accounts began making increasingly explicit threats toward Rag and the other captives as the delay stretched from a day into several. This is worth sitting with, because it captures something the previous chapters haven't quite touched on yet, the specific compounding dread of communication that has to travel one direction at a time, with no way to confirm receipt, no way to check progress, nothing but waiting and worst-case assumptions filling in whatever gap the silence left behind. A modern hostage negotiator has phone lines, relay teams, and the ability to hear a captor's exact tone of voice change in real time. Teach's messengers had none of that. They had a rowboat, a memorized message, and a return journey that, the longer it stretched, looked increasingly like it might not happen at all. Every additional hour of silence gave Teach's own imagination more room to fill in the worst possible explanation, and gave the men still waiting ashore in Charleston the same room to imagine the worst about him. The chest of medicine was eventually delivered, and the hostages, including Rag, were released largely unharmed, though several period accounts note that at least some of the captives were stripped of their fine clothing and other personal valuables before being allowed to row back to shore, a petty, almost theatrical final indignity layered on top of a week that had already terrified an entire town. The actual moment of release, when it finally came, carried its own strange, deflating anticlimax after days of mounting dread. Rag and the other hostages were rowed back toward the harbour in the same small boats that had carried them out. No ceremony, no final confrontation, simply men who had spent days genuinely uncertain whether they'd survive the week suddenly finding themselves back on familiar water, stripped of their finer possessions but otherwise intact. Accounts describe the town's relief as immediate and considerable once word spread that the hostages were safe, church bells reportedly ringing in at least one contemporary description, and entire communities held breath, finally released in the space of an afternoon. News of the blockade itself didn't stay confined to Charleston for long. Within weeks, accounts of the episode had travelled up the American coast, through exactly the kind of informal network covered in earlier chapters. Ships' captains relaying what they'd heard to the next port. Colonial newspapers as far away as Boston eventually printing versions of the story. Each retelling, adding or dropping details the way any story does after enough hands have carried it. Forward. By the time Teach's name reached readers in New England weeks after the actual events on the water, the story had already begun hardening into legend, the specific, human tedium of a delayed apothecary's errand, quietly dropped somewhere along the way in favour of a cleaner, more frightening narrative. It's a small, early example of exactly the kind of process that would later produce Charles Johnson's dramatised chronicle. History compressing itself into story with each retelling, losing precision in exchange for a shape people could actually remember and repeat. Charleston's harbour reopened, ordinary shipping resumed, and Teach's squadron. Having accomplished in roughly a week what might otherwise have taken months of individually chasing down merchant vessels one at a time, sailed north along the Carolina coast, flush with medicine, cargo, and a reputation that had just grown considerably darker in the retelling. That reputation, and the fleet that had earned it, wouldn't survive much longer intact. Within weeks of leaving Charleston, Queen Anne's Revenge ran aground near Topsail Inlet, close to present-day Beaufort, North Carolina, along with at least one of the smaller sloops sailing in consort with her. The immediate aftermath thinned Teach's crew dramatically, where his combined fleet had reportedly numbered somewhere close to 300 men at its peak, just weeks earlier in Charleston's harbour. The force that continued on with Teach afterward numbered closer to 40, a reduction historians have long found difficult to explain through accident alone. Whether this was simple bad luck, a genuine navigational error in poorly charted, shifting coastal shallows, or something more deliberate on Teach's part, remains a subject of real historical debate rather than settled fact. Some historians have argued the grounding may have been intentional, a way for Teach to quietly reduce the size of his crew and, by extension, the number of shares his remaining cargo and coin would need to be divided among, abandoning a portion of his own men on a nearby sandbar, or in the small settlement of Bath in the process, several dozen of them reportedly accepting the king's pardon there not long afterward, rather than continuing on with a captain whose luck, or whose intentions, had suddenly become considerably harder to trust. Others read it as exactly what the surviving accounts describe on their face, an accident born of unfamiliar water and an overloaded ship, the same kind of ordinary maritime disaster that claimed vessels far more innocently crude than Teach's throughout this entire era. Either explanation fits uncomfortably well with a man who had just spent a week demonstrating, in front of an entire colonial government, exactly how far he was willing to go when the stakes were high enough. Either explanation fits uncomfortably well with a man who had just spent a week demonstrating, in front of an entire colonial government, exactly how far he was willing to go when the stakes were high enough, and the timing alone, mere weeks after the single most successful negotiation of his entire career, invites the uncomfortable question of whether a man who had just proven himself this capable of controlled, patient extortion might also have been entirely capable of a colder, more calculated betrayal of his own crew when the arithmetic of shares and mouths to feed no longer suited him. The Charleston blockade stands, among everything covered so far tonight, as the clearest example of pirate communication reaching directly into the world of formal land-based politics, a negotiation conducted not ship to ship or ship to fixed harbour, but ship to city, mediated entirely by messengers whose journey ashore and back represented, for several tense days in May of 1718, the single slowest and highest stakes communication channel any pirate crew in this story ever relied on. It worked, in the narrow sense that Teach got his medicine and released his hostages without a full-scale battle ever developing, but it worked precisely because both sides understood the same underlying fact. When a message can only travel as fast as the person carrying it, and when that person's safe return is the only proof either side has that the other is negotiating in good faith, the silence in between becomes its own kind of weapon, wielded, whether deliberately or not, by whoever controls how long that silence gets to stretch, There's a particular kind of wonder worth sitting with here too, easy to overlook underneath the fear and the extortion and the general menace of the whole episode. An entire negotiation, one with a colonial council member's life genuinely at stake, one involving a fleet capable of shutting down a major port's trade entirely, was conducted without a single written treaty, without any formal diplomatic channel, without anything resembling the structured communication a modern hostage crisis would involve. It ran instead on rowboats, on word of mouth, on the simple fragile trust that a man sent ashore with a message would actually return with an answer rather than simply vanish into the town himself, that it worked at all, that both sides managed to navigate several days of near-total blindness to what the other was actually doing and arrive at a peaceful resolution anyway, says something about how resourceful ordinary communication becomes when the alternative is genuinely catastrophic for everyone involved. Blackbeard would not survive the year that followed, and the manner of his death. Several months later, off a shallow inlet not far from where Queen Anne's Revenge had run aground, involved its own remarkable feat of pirate communication, though this time the message being sent was considerably less subtle than a chest of medicine, and far more final for everyone involved. That final, considerably less subtle message would arrive not by rowboat or written demand, but by deception dressed up as weakness, the oldest trick in naval warfare turned against the very man who had, for 2 years, been its most feared practitioner. The quill feels wrong in your hand before you've even dipped it, too light and too formal for fingers that have spent the last 3 years hauling line and scrubbing decks. And the parchment in front of you smells faintly of candle smoke and the particular mustiness of paper that's already been signed by 30 other men before you. You're standing in the cramped great cabin of a newly captured sloop, somewhere in 1720, having just been given the same choice extended to nearly every useful sailor a pirate crew takes. Sign the ship's articles and join as a full member, or don't, and take your chances with whatever happens to prisoners who decline. Most men sign. You're about to. What you're actually signing, though, isn't what you expected walking in. You'd pictured, if you'd pictured anything at all, a captain's word taken as law, the same rigid top-down hierarchy you'd known aboard the merchant vessel that had until yesterday been your entire working life. Instead, the quartermaster reads the articles aloud to the assembled crew before anyone signs. A document negotiated and agreed to by vote among the men themselves, not handed down from above, each clause read slowly enough that even the least literate hand aboard could follow along and raise an objection if something struck him as unfair before ever putting quill to paper. Article 1, more or less, concerns how prize money gets divided. Article 2 covers what happens to a man caught stealing from a fellow crew member, or gambling with dice or cards aboard ship, both forbidden on this particular vessel apparently, after some earlier dispute nobody bothers explaining to you in detail. Somewhere around Article 6 or 7 comes the part that actually stops your hand mid-air over the parchment, a schedule of compensation for injury, specific sums promised, in advance, for the loss of an eye, a hand, a leg, sums the whole crew has already agreed to honour before anyone's actually lost anything. Standing near the back of the assembled crew during that first reading was a broad-shouldered man named Willett, a former ship's carpenter pressed into service the same way you had been, who caught your eye afterward and offered the kind of small, wordless nod that passes for welcome among men who've all recently had the same decision forced on them. He'd been aboard 4 months longer than you, long enough to have opinions about which parts of the articles actually mattered in practice and which existed mostly on paper, and he had a habit, you'd learn over the following weeks, of quietly explaining unfamiliar shipboard customs to newer hands without ever making a show of the kindness. Correcting your knot work once without comment beyond a brief demonstration, the kind of small unspoken decency that costs a man nothing and means considerably more than it should to whoever's on the receiving end of it 3,000 miles from anything resembling home. By your first week under these articles, you've started to understand that this document functions as something considerably more sophisticated than a simple rulebook. It's a communication system in its own right, one that operates across time rather than across distance, the same basic principle as the rendezvous point covered earlier tonight. Except instead of telling scattered ships where to meet, it tells an entire crew, in advance and in writing, exactly what to expect from each other under circumstances nobody could fully predict when they signed. A captain injured in battle knows exactly what is owed. A powder monkey losing fingers to a snapped line knows the same. Nobody has to negotiate compensation in the chaos of the moment, because the negotiation already happened, calmly in port, before any of it mattered yet. Some of the article's more mundane provisions took longer to make sense to you than the dramatic ones had. A rule requiring candles and open lanterns extinguished by 8 in the evening seemed, at first glance, almost quaintly restrictive for a crew otherwise defined by its total disregard for authority. Willett explained it to you plainly enough one evening. A wooden ship, packed with gunpowder and loose canvas, and men who'd been drinking captured rum since the afternoon, was one dropped candle away from disaster, and no article about compensation for lost limbs did a man any good if the entire vessel burned to the waterline with him still aboard it. The gambling prohibition, similarly, existed less out of any moral objection to dice or cards, and more from hard, repeated experience, armed men with disposable coin and long stretches of boredom between prizes, made for exactly the kind of dispute that ended in bloodshed if left unregulated, and a crew that couldn't afford to lose members to its own internal quarrels had every practical reason to. Simply remove the temptation by written rule. The vote itself, when it came 2 days later after the previous captain proved himself, in the crew's collective judgment, too cautious for the season's remaining prizes, surprised you more than the articles had. Every man aboard, prisoner turned crew and veteran alike, held one voice in the matter, called up on deck one by one to state a name. The results tallied openly by the quartermaster in front of everyone, rather than decided behind closed doors. This wasn't democracy in any grand idealistic sense, and nobody aboard would have described it that way. It was closer to a business partnership with unusually direct stakes, every man's life and share tied to the same decision, which perhaps explains why the voting itself was taken so seriously despite the general chaos everywhere else aboard. Here's the thing about a system like this that took you longer to appreciate than it probably should have. You'd spent your entire prior career aboard ships where a captain's word was final, where questioning an order could mean a flogging, where the entire chain of command flowed exactly one direction and never back. Aboard a merchant vessel, in the Royal Navy, across nearly every legitimate maritime institution of the era, that arrangement was simply how things worked. Full stop. Here, the captain could be removed by the same vote that had elected him, and in practice frequently was whenever a crew judged his decisions had stopped serving their collective interest. Congratulations. You'd just joined one of the only workplaces in the entire 18th century Atlantic world where the people doing the actual work held a genuine structural say in who led them and how the profits got divided. By your 3rd week, you'd met the quartermaster properly, a stocky, unhurried man everyone called Old Tobias, whose actual job aboard ship turned out to be considerably more involved than you'd assumed from the title alone. He wasn't simply second in command in the way a first mate might be aboard a merchant ship. He was, in practice, the crew's internal communication system, the man responsible for distributing food and provisions fairly, for settling disputes between crew members before they escalated into something requiring the captain's direct intervention, for keeping the article's actual terms fresh in everyone's memory well after the initial reading. Tobias had a habit, you noticed within your first few days, of settling minor arguments over rations, or watch assignments with the same phrase every time. Some version of that's not what the articles say, and you all agreed to what the articles say, delivered with enough flat, unbothered authority that it usually ended the argument on the spot. 3 weeks into your time aboard, you watched old Tobias handle a dispute that illustrated exactly why this internal communication mattered as much as any flag code or rendezvous point covered earlier tonight. 2 crew members, a burly topman and a younger hand barely out of his teens, nearly came to blows over a disputed share of captured rum, each insisting the other had taken more than his fair portion. rather than let it escalate or simply rule by personal authority the way a merchant captain might have, Tobias called for the actual articles to be read aloud again, the specific clause covering distribution of captured spirits, in front of both men and whoever else on deck cared to listen. The dispute resolved itself within minutes, not because Tobias had cleverly out-argued anyone, but because the written terms, agreed to by vote weeks earlier, left very little room for two men to keep disagreeing once the actual words were sitting in front of them. You learned, too, roughly a month in, that not every crew's articles looked quite like the ones you'd signed, a fact that reached you the same way most useful information reached anyone aboard this ship, second-hand, via a captured vessel. A small sloop taken off the Bahama Banks turned out, once questioned, to have briefly sailed under a different pirate crew's articles the previous year before that particular venture dissolved, and the captured sailor who'd served aboard her described terms considerably harsher than your own, no vote at all for newly pressed men. A captain who'd simply declared himself in permanent command rather than standing for periodic re-election, and a compensation schedule for injury that existed on paper but that by this sailor's account had never actually been honoured in practice. Willett, listening to this account alongside you, said only that you'd both apparently signed with a better class of criminal, delivered dry enough that it took you a moment to realise he meant it as a joke rather than a simple statement of fact. It's easy, hearing a comparison like that, to forget that pirate crew was never a single, uniform institution. Some genuinely honoured the democratic promises baked into their articles, others used the same language purely for recruitment, then abandoned it the moment actual authority was at stake. You'd think, given how much easier the second approach would be for any captain determined to keep total control, that it would have been the more common arrangement. That it apparently wasn't, at least not universally, says something about how much practical value a crew placed on the promise itself, and how quickly a captain who broke that promise could expect to find himself outvoted, marooned, or worse, by men who had, after all, armed themselves willingly, and had nothing structurally stopping them from turning those weapons on their own leadership if the contract stopped being honoured. By the time you'd been aboard 2 months, the practical machinery of shares had become as familiar to you as the rigging itself. The captain and quartermaster typically drew a larger portion, something in the range of 1.5 to 2 full shares each, according to the specific articles you'd signed, a modest premium for the added responsibility and risk, rather than the vastly disproportionate cut a merchant captain or naval officer might claim over his crew's labour. Ordinary hands like yourself drew a single full share. Boys and those newly aboard sometimes drew a half share until they'd proven themselves, a graduated system that, whatever its flaws, at least made the actual math of compensation visible and predictable to everyone involved, rather than dependent on a captain's private ledger nobody else was permitted to see. What happens when the articles actually get tested, when an injury serious enough to trigger the compensation clauses actually occurs, rather than remaining a hypothetical line on a page everyone signed and mostly forgot, is a different matter, and worth its own moment before this day's walkthrough continues. That moment came just past the 2-month mark, during a hasty boarding action against a small Dutch trader that resisted longer than anyone expected. A crewman named Willett, the same broad-shouldered carpenter who'd nodded a wordless welcome to you on your very first day aboard, took a pistol ball through his lower leg, a wound the ship's makeshift surgeon judged, within the hour. Would cost him the limb below the knee if infection didn't claim more of him first. You were the one who half carried him below when it happened, his arms slung over your shoulder, the two of you moving in the awkward, staggering rhythm of a man trying not to put weight on a leg that could no longer bear any, and you remember, more clearly than almost anything else from that entire voyage, the particular steadiness in his voice even then, asking after the rest of the crew before he'd say a single word about himself. What happened over the following days said everything about why men kept signing these articles, despite the very real danger the document itself existed to compensate for. Willett received his promised sum, several hundred pieces of 8 according to the schedule the crew had voted to honour months before he'd ever lost anything, paid out publicly, without argument, without any captain's discretion involved in deciding whether he deserved it. Old Tobias himself counted out the coin in front of the assembled crew, a small, deliberate act of transparency that felt, in the moment, like the closest thing this ship had to a funeral rite and a celebration at once. Grief for what Willett had lost, sitting right alongside genuine relief that the promise made months earlier had actually held. He wasn't set ashore penniless the moment he stopped being useful with a cutlass. He was, within the narrow, harsh logic of this particular trade, taken care of, exactly as promised, by men who had every practical reason to simply let the matter slide, and every contractual reason not to. Willett stayed aboard afterward, in a reduced capacity that the crew adjusted to without much discussion, taking on carpentry work below decks that didn't require 2 working legs, and something in the way the rest of the crew treated him after, a little more careful with his balance on a rolling deck, a little quicker to save him the easier tasks without ever quite saying so out loud, told you more about what actually held this crew together than any article you'd read aloud during that first cramped. Signing in the great cabin. By your 5th week, the actual daily rhythm the articles imposed had settled into something almost mundane. Watches rotated on a fixed schedule, agreed to the same way everything else aboard got agreed to. 4 hours on and 4 off through the night, longer stretches during daylight when the work demanded it, with disputes over an unfair rotation handled by Tobias's now familiar refrain about what the articles actually said, rather than what any one man felt like arguing for in the moment. There was something almost comically bureaucratic about it, you thought more than once, watching grown men who'd willingly joined a life of armed robbery on the high seas argue with genuine passion over whether the dog watch had been assigned fairly 2 nights running. Piracy, it turned out, involved considerably more committee process than the stories back home had ever suggested. Even mealtimes followed a version of this same logic, portions measured out according to a schedule Tobias kept largely in his head, but would recite, word for word and without apparent irritation, to anyone who questioned whether they'd been shorted. You found yourself, more than once, missing the simple, unaccountable arbitrariness of your old merchant captain's rule, if only because arguing with a written document proved considerably harder than arguing with a man. You noticed, too, over your months aboard, that the articles constrained the captain nearly as much as they governed everyone beneath him, a detail that surprised you more than almost anything else about this strange floating arrangement. Surviving copies of articles from several crews of this era, including versions recorded for Bartholomew Roberts's ship, reportedly granted the captain unquestioned authority only during an actual engagement, boarding, or chase. Moments when a single, fast decision genuinely mattered more than group consensus. Outside of combat, that same authority narrowed considerably decisions about course, about which prizes to pursue, about how to divide captured goods, all subject to the same voting process that had put him in command in the first place, and that could, with sufficient cause and sufficient votes, remove him from it just as easily. Your own captain, a wiry, quick-tempered man named Harker, seemed to understand this arrangement better than most, deferring openly to crew consensus on matters that fell outside battle even when his own preference clearly ran the other way, a kind of restraint you doubted you'd ever have witnessed from a Royal Navy officer holding equivalent rank. Power that could be voted away, it turned out, tended to get exercised rather more carefully than power that couldn't. By your 4th month aboard, you'd started to understand something the articles had been quietly teaching you the entire time, mostly without you noticing the lesson as it happened. A pirate crew wasn't a village, wasn't a family in any sentimental sense, and nobody aboard mistook it for either. Men came and went, signed on and occasionally deserted, died in battle or from disease, or simply from the accumulated wear of a genuinely brutal trade. What held this particular collection of strangers together across that constant churn wasn't affection, mostly, though genuine friendships, the kind you'd formed with Willett across 4 months of shared watches and small unremarked kindnesses, certainly grew along the way regardless. It was the document itself, read aloud, voted on, and honoured with a consistency that would have shocked most legitimate employers of the era, a written promise that functioned, in its own strange way, as the single most reliable form of communication anyone aboard this ship possessed, a message from the crew's collective past self to whatever crisis its future self might eventually face. Agreed to before anyone knew exactly what shape that crisis would take, or whose leg it would eventually cost. The written word in this particular corner of the 18th century Atlantic had done something genuinely unusual. It had turned a temporary, coerced, endlessly rotating population of strangers into something that functioned, for the length of a single voyage at least, like a genuinely accountable institution, one where a powder monkey's lost fingers and a captain's authority were both, in their own way, governed by the exact same document, agreed to by the exact same vote, honoured by the exact same crew. It's worth sitting with how rare that actually was. Nowhere else in the 18th century Atlantic world, not aboard a merchant ship, not in the Royal Navy, not in most trades ashore, could an ordinary labouring man expect a written, voted-on guarantee of what he was owed if the work cost him a limb. He'd signed articles with pirates to get it. There's a specific, comically bureaucratic detail worth adding here too, easy to overlook amid the larger drama of votes and compensation schedules. Old Tobias kept, by more than one account among the crew, an actual running tally of minor disputes and their resolutions scratched into the margin of his own private notebook, less out of any legal necessity and more, he admitted once when pressed, because a quartermaster who couldn't remember how he'd ruled on an identical argument 3 weeks earlier tended to lose the crew's confidence fast. It's a small, almost mundane detail, a pirate quartermaster keeping something close to case law scribbled in the margins of a battered notebook, but it captures something true about how seriously this crew took the whole apparatus of self-governance, even in its smallest, least dramatic corners. Not every voice recorded in this era's surviving trial documents belonged to a man who signed articles willingly, and not every crew that voted on a captain did so with anything resembling free choice at the start. The next chapter of tonight's journey turns to a battle where all of this democratic machinery, the votes, the shares, the carefully negotiated compensation, meant considerably less than the split-second decisions made in the final chaotic minutes of a fight nobody aboard expected to survive. On the morning of November 22nd, 1718, Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy stood on the deck of a small, hastily commandeered sloop, watching a second, larger vessel drift toward him across the shallow waters of Ocracoke Inlet, off the coast of North Carolina, and understood that everything about the fight he was about to enter depended on a lie his own crew was about to tell with their bodies rather than their words. Aboard the approaching ship stood Edward Teach, the man the world would remember as Blackbeard, watching Maynard's deck and counting, or believing he was counting, exactly how many men he'd soon be fighting. He was about to be wrong, and the manner of that wrongness would end his life within the hour. The inlet itself, shallow, sandy, and threaded with shifting channels that shifted further with every storm, had been exactly the kind of ground Teach favoured for this stage of his career, water treacherous enough to discourage the deep-hulled Royal Navy warships that might otherwise have hunted him directly, but familiar enough to a man who'd spent years working this coast that he could navigate it with a confidence few pursuers could match. Local knowledge, in other words, functioned here as its own quiet form of advantage, an intimacy with a specific stretch of water that no chart of the era could fully capture, built up over repeated passages the way any skill gets built, through simple, accumulated repetition, rather than any single dramatic lesson. Maynard's own approach, picking his way carefully through the same shallows the evening before, understood exactly what kind of advantage he was giving up simply by entering these waters at all, and exactly why no larger, better-armed vessel had managed to end Teach's career here already. This is the story of the last message Blackbeard ever received, one delivered not by flag, not by trumpet, not by any of the systems covered so far tonight, but by the oldest and simplest form of deception available to anyone at sea, making an enemy believe exactly what you wanted him to believe, using nothing but the appearance of your own deck. Governor Spotswood's motivation for funding this expedition at his own colony's expense, rather than simply waiting for North Carolina's authorities to act, involved its own quieter communication problem worth noting. Spotswood had grown convinced, based on reports reaching him through exactly the kind of informal maritime gossip network covered throughout tonight's journey, that North Carolina's own governor, Charles Eden, had grown suspiciously tolerant of Teach's continued presence near Bath. Some accounts suggesting Eden had even profited quietly from goods Teach brought ashore there. Unable to trust the neighbouring colony's own authorities to act, Spotswood organised the expedition independently, offering a reward reportedly set at around £100 for Teach himself, with smaller, graduated sums promised for officers and ordinary crew members taken or killed alongside him. A bounty structure not unlike the compensation schedules covered in the previous chapter, except this one existed to incentivise a pirate's death rather than protect a pirate's crew. By the autumn of 1718, Teach's reputation had grown considerably more troublesome to colonial authorities than his actual remaining force probably justified. Since the Charleston blockade and the loss of most of his fleet at Topsail Inlet months earlier, he'd settled into a smaller, quieter operation, reportedly accepting the king's pardon at one point before drifting back toward familiar habits, based loosely around Ocracoke Inlet and the nearby settlement of Bath in North Carolina, a stretch of coast whose shallow, difficult waters made it naturally resistant to pursuit by larger, deeper draft naval vessels. Alexander Spotswood, the governor of neighbouring Virginia, had grown sufficiently alarmed by reports of Teach's continued activity and sufficiently frustrated by North Carolina's own apparent unwillingness or inability to deal with him, that he authorised and funded an expedition to hunt Teach down directly, dispatching 2 small, shallow draft sloops under Maynard's command specifically because they could navigate the same difficult inlet waters that had long protected Teach from larger pursuers. Teach's own crew at Ocracoke that morning numbered far fewer than the reputation preceding him might suggest, somewhere around 20 men by most accounts, a reduced force that reflected both the earlier losses at Topsail Inlet and a captain whose relationship with his own remaining men had grown considerably more volatile in the months since. Teach's own crew at Ocracoke that morning numbered far fewer than the reputation preceding him might suggest, somewhere around 20 men by most accounts, a reduced force that reflected both the earlier losses at Topsail Inlet and a captain whose relationship with his own remaining men had grown considerably more volatile in the months since. Contrast that number against the reputation still attached to his name up and down the American coast, a name colonial governors invoked to justify entire naval expeditions, a name merchant captains still altered their planned routes to avoid. And the gap between the man and the myth becomes almost startling. 20 men, a single aging ship, and a coastline he knew better than his pursuers did. That was the entire remaining substance behind one of the most feared names in the history of piracy by the time Maynard's sloops finally found him. One episode from this period, recounted later in testimony given by a man named Israel Hands, who had served as one of Teach's officers before the events at Ocracoke, offers a genuinely unsettling window into the atmosphere aboard ship during these final months. According to Hans's own account, given under considerably more legal scrutiny than Johnson's usual sources, and therefore treated with somewhat more confidence by historians, Teach had shot him in the knee one evening below decks, apparently without any specific provocation beyond a drunken remark that the crew ought to occasionally remember who commanded them. An act of violence directed not at an enemy, but at his own quartermaster, crippling a man who had served him loyally for months. Hans, not present at the final battle as a result of that same injury, survived the encounter and survived Teach himself by a considerable margin, eventually giving testimony that helped shape the historical record of exactly the kind of unpredictable menace that had, by this point in Teach's career, apparently begun turning inward on his own crew as readily as outward toward his enemies. Maynard arrived off Ocracoke on the evening of November 21st, and here the story's central piece of deception begins to take shape, born not from any clever signal or coded message, but from simple tactical necessity. Maynard's own force was modest, somewhere in the range of 50-odd men split across his two sloops, and he understood, studying the larger vessel anchored ahead of him in the fading light, that a straightforward approach, decks visibly crowded with armed men, would give Teach every advantage of preparation before the fighting even began. So Maynard made a decision that would define the entire engagement. He ordered the bulk of his crew below decks, out of sight entirely, leaving only a handful of men visible above, along with himself and the ship's pilots, creating from a distance the unmistakable impression of a badly undermanned vessel approaching an obviously superior opponent. Teach, watching this apparent weakness develop across the water as dawn broke on the 22nd, read the scene exactly the way Maynard intended him to. By several surviving accounts, Teach reportedly hailed the approaching sloop, and upon seeing what looked like a sparse, thin crew on deck, grew considerably more confident than caution should have allowed. A man who had spent 2 years building a reputation, fearsome enough that most targets simply surrendered rather than fight, now facing what appeared to be an easy, almost insulting mismatch in his own favour. This is worth sitting with, because it inverts nearly everything covered in the earlier chapter about flags and reputation. There, a fearsome reputation had done a portion of the fighting before a shot was ever fired, convincing merchant crews to surrender rather than resist. Here, that same confidence, earned across dozens of encounters where it had served him perfectly well, became the exact vulnerability Maynard's deception was built to exploit. The night before the engagement passed slowly, for both crews anchored within sight of each other across the darkened inlet, close enough that the creak of rigging and the occasional voice carried faintly across the water in the stillness, a proximity that must have made the coming morning feel less like a surprise and more like an appointment neither side could avoid keeping. Maynard's men, packed below decks for the deception that would define the battle's opening minutes, spent those final hours in cramped, sweating silence, checking weapons by feel more than sight, listening to muffled orders passed in low voices rather than shouted across open air the way a normal ship's business usually proceeded. It's worth remembering that these men had volunteered, or been assigned, to a plan that required them to sit hidden and helpless while their own vessel appeared, from the outside, dangerously undermanned, trusting entirely in a lieutenant's judgment and in each other's discipline not to break cover a moment too soon. As the two vessels closed, Maynard's sloop ran aground briefly in the shallow water, a moment of genuine danger that, by grim coincidence, only reinforced the impression of a struggling, disadvantaged crew rather than revealing the deception underneath. Teach, apparently believing the fight already half won, brought his own ship alongside and, according to several period accounts, personally led a boarding party across onto Maynard's deck, the same aggressive, decisive tactic that had served him in dozens of previous encounters against merchant crews who'd simply struck their colours rather than resist at all. What happened in the next several minutes represents, among everything covered across this entire journey tonight, communication at its most brutal and immediate. No flag, no code, no carefully negotiated message. Just Maynard's hidden crew erupting from below decks the instant Teach's boarding party had committed themselves fully to the attack. A signal requiring no cloth or gunpowder at all, simply the sudden, overwhelming appearance of men who moments earlier hadn't seemed to exist. The fighting that followed was close, brutal, and by every surviving account genuinely chaotic, cutlasses and pistols at a range measured in feet rather than yards, Maynard himself reportedly engaging Teach directly in the melee that followed. Maynard paid a real cost for the victory his deception ultimately secured, a fact the more celebratory later retellings tend to underplay. Several of his own men died in the close, chaotic fighting that followed Teach's boarding, among them, by Maynard's own official report, a man whose loss he specifically noted with more than the flat procedural language he used for most of the account, a rare crack of genuine feeling in an otherwise businesslike document. Victory, even a decisive one, even one that ended the career of the single most feared pirate operating off the American coast, still meant carrying news of dead shipmates back to Virginia, alongside whatever grim proof of Teach's own death travelled with them on the same voyage, two very different messages sharing the same bowsprit and the same slow journey home. Teach, by the accounts that survive, including a widely cited description of the wounds he sustained, fought with a ferocity that several witnesses found genuinely remarkable even by the standards of a man with his reputation. Reportedly absorbing numerous pistol shots and sword wounds, a count that later retellings inflated into the range of 20 or more separate injuries, a figure modern historians treat with real skepticism given how thoroughly it traces back to Johnson's dramatised chronicle, rather than more sober contemporary sources. What does seem well corroborated across multiple accounts, including Maynard's own official report to Spotswood, is that Teach fought on for a genuinely extended stretch after wounds that would have ended most engagements immediately before finally falling, and that his death effectively ended the battle within minutes, his remaining crew, considerably outmatched once the numerical deception had been revealed, quickly overwhelmed or surrendering. Maynard's report to Spotswood afterward describes the immediate aftermath in the flat, procedural language typical of an official military account rather than the dramatised retelling later writers would prefer. Teach's head severed and displayed from the bowsprit of Maynard's own sloop for the return voyage, a grim but historically well-documented practice of the era intended to serve as unambiguous proof that the specific pirate in question was, in fact, dead, a form of communication with a very particular audience in mind. A written report, however detailed, could be doubted, disputed, or simply disbelieved by a colonial government eager for confirmation, and by a public whose confidence in trade required certainty rather than rumour. A head, displayed openly for the length of an entire voyage back to Virginia, left considerably less room for doubt. An act simultaneously grotesque and, from a purely functional standpoint, remarkably effective at delivering an unambiguous message across an information landscape, where verified news travelled slowly and false reports of a famous pirate's death had, on more than one occasion in this era, turned out to be premature or simply wrong. The legend that grew up around Teach's death outpaced the sober facts almost immediately, in exactly the pattern this entire journey has traced again and again tonight. Within a few short years, Johnson's general history had transformed a documented, if genuinely dramatic, naval engagement into something closer to myth, Teach's decapitated body reportedly swimming several times around Maynard's ship before finally sinking, a detail no contemporary official account supports and that most serious historians treat as pure embellishment, the kind of story that grows more vivid with each retelling precisely because the truth, however dramatic on its own terms, apparently wasn't dramatic enough for whoever was doing the retelling. Even the number of wounds Teach supposedly absorbed grew with each passing decade of retelling, inflating well past what any contemporary surgeon's account could plausibly support, until the man himself had become considerably harder to kill in legend than he'd apparently been in the actual documented fight. It's worth remembering, hearing a detail like that the same process covered back in the very first chapter tonight, legend quietly sliding into the space where verified fact ran out, applies just as thoroughly to Teach's death as it does to his flag. Word of Teach's death reached the surviving crews who had once sailed under him, or under captains like him, scattered across the Caribbean and the American coast through exactly the same slow second-hand channels that had carried every other piece of news across this entire journey tonight. A merchant sailor mentions it to a fisherman. The fisherman mentions it in a tavern. Someone in the tavern happens to know a man who happens to know a man still aboard a pirate crew somewhere off the Bahamas. And weeks later, the news finally reaches ears that had genuine practical reasons to care. For some, the news meant reconsidering the pardon still technically on offer, one less reason to believe piracy still had a long future in these waters. For others, it meant nothing more than one fewer rival to compete with for prizes and territory. Death, even the death of the era's single most famous pirate, still travelled at the speed of an ordinary conversation, no faster and no slower than any other piece of news covered tonight. News of Teach's actual death spread from that single grim piece of physical proof outward through exactly the same networks covered throughout tonight's journey. Ships carrying word port to port, newspapers eventually printing accounts weeks after the actual engagement, taverns and wharves buzzing with a story that this time had the unusual advantage of being verifiably true rather than merely rumoured. For a population of merchant sailors who had spent years adjusting their routes and their nerves around the mere possibility of encountering Blackbeard's ship on any given crossing. The confirmed news that he was actually finally dead represented one of the single most consequential pieces of information the entire Atlantic trading world received that year, and it travelled, like everything else in this story, at the speed of the fastest available ship rather than anything faster. There's a specific, quiet detail worth sitting with before this chapter turns to its close, easy to lose beneath the violence and the grim trophy at the bowsprit. Maynard himself, by every surviving account, took no particular pleasure in what he'd accomplished, his official report reading throughout like the work of a man documenting a difficult, costly job rather than celebrating a triumph. Careful to name his own dead, careful to record the numbers on both sides without obvious embellishment, a restraint that stands in sharp contrast to the increasingly theatrical retellings that would follow within a few short years. It's a small thing, a lieutenant's dry procedural prose surviving alongside the myth that grew up around it. But it's exactly the kind of small thing this whole journey has kept circling back to, the quieter, more honest version of events, sitting patiently in an archive somewhere, while the louder, more dramatic version does most of the actual travelling. History, it turns out, rarely competes fairly with legend for an audience's attention, and it almost never wins the race for whoever's simply repeating the best story they've heard. What makes the Ocracoke engagement worth including in a chapter otherwise devoted to communication is precisely how it inverts every system covered earlier tonight. The flag, the signal code, the careful, negotiated demand sent ashore by rowboat in Charleston. All of these depended on both sides more or less agreeing to trust what the other was showing them. Maynard's entire strategy depended on the opposite, presenting information he knew to be false, an empty deck, an outmatched crew, and trusting that Teach, reading the same visual signals that had served him reliably for 2 years across dozens of legitimate encounters, would believe the lie completely enough to act on it. It's the same false colours principle covered in the very first chapter of tonight's journey, a ship pretending to be something it isn't, except here the deception wasn't about a nation's flag at all. It was about the single most valuable piece of information any pirate captain ever relied on to gauge a fight before committing to it: how many men stood on the other deck. Blackbeard had spent 2 years mastering the art of communicating threat convincingly enough that most targets never tested it. In the final hour of his life, that same instinct, the trained habit of reading a deck's visible crew and drawing quick, confident conclusions from what he saw there, became the exact channel through which the most consequential deception of his career finally reached him. Not every pirate crew's story ended in a battle this decisive, or this well documented. For most, the far more ordinary business of survival meant simply waiting. Ashore in whatever haven still felt safe, for word of what was coming next. The rum smells sharper here than it did back on the ship, cut with something like burnt sugar and the underlying mustiness of a tavern that never quite dries out between the coastal rains, and it's the first thing you notice stepping through the doorway of a low canvas-roofed drinking house somewhere in a pirate haven. Sometime around 1717, a season you're spending ashore while your ship undergoes careening and repair on the beach nearby. You've got coin in your pocket for the first time in months, a share of the last voyage's take, and nothing much to do with your days except wait, the way every man in this settlement seems to be waiting for something. A ship, a buyer, a piece of news that hasn't arrived yet. This is, you're slowly discovering, the actual daily texture of life in a place like this, considerably less dramatic than the fighting that funds it. You spend your first morning ashore doing what half the settlement seems to spend every morning doing, walking the waterfront, scanning incoming sails for a flag or a silhouette you recognise, hoping today's the day some particular ship finally arrives, carrying whatever specific piece of news you've been waiting weeks to hear. There's no schedule to any of this, no way to know if today's the day, or if you'll be doing the exact same walk again tomorrow, and the following day, and the one after that, a rhythm considerably more patient and considerably more boring than any tale told about this life back in the taverns of whatever port you'd originally shipped out of. The settlement itself, once your eyes adjusted past the first morning's disorientation, turned out to be considerably less romantic than any tavern song about pirate havens ever suggested. Rows of hastily built huts crowded the shoreline behind the beach, where your own ship lay careened on its side, canvas awnings strung between salvaged spars. Cook fires sending up thin trails of smoke that mixed unpleasantly with the smell of rendered turtle fat and the standing, stagnant water that collected in low spots after every rain. Flies were a constant, unglamorous presence, drawn by fish guts and worse left to rot in the heat, and more than one man you met during those first days ashore carried the particular yellowish pallor of fever, a fact nobody discussed directly, but that everyone quietly avoided sitting too close to. This was, you were slowly realizing, less a pirate's paradise than a genuinely difficult place to survive for any extended stretch. Its freedom bought at the cost of sanitation, medicine, and most of the ordinary comforts a proper town might have offered. By your third day ashore, you've learned that the tavern functions as something closer to the settlement's actual nervous system than its liver, whatever the quantity of rum consumed there might suggest otherwise. Every arriving sailor eventually finds his way to one of these low, crowded rooms, and every arriving sailor carries some fragment of news from wherever he's last been, traded freely for a drink and a sympathetic ear. You've started recognizing the pattern. A new face walks in, orders rum, and within minutes finds himself surrounded by men asking the same handful of questions in different orders. Any Navy ships sighted? Any word from crews working the Cuban coast? Has anyone heard whether the rumoured pardon is actually real, or just another rumour dressed up as fact? It became, within your first week, something close to a ritual, this particular choreography of arrival and interrogation, one you found yourself performing on newer arrivals soon enough yourself, the settlement's newest resident already fluent in its oldest custom. That last question, more than any other, dominates conversation by your second week ashore, because word of a king's proclamation offering pardon to any pirate willing to surrender has apparently been circulating through the settlement for some time now, arriving the same second-hand, unreliable way most news arrives here, garbled slightly differently by every sailor who repeats it. You hear 3 different versions of the pardon's actual terms within your first few days alone, one insisting it applies only to men who surrender within a matter of weeks, another claiming the deadline stretches out considerably longer, a third insisting the whole thing is a trap designed to lure men into a harbour where the Navy can simply hang them once they've disarmed. Nobody in the tavern seems entirely certain which version is accurate, and the uncertainty itself has become its own kind of information, a settlement-wide anxiety with no fixed shape yet, waiting for an actual printed copy of the proclamation to finally settle the argument one way or another. Sitting near you most evenings during this stretch is a weathered, quiet man named Abrams, a former ship's cooper who'd been sailing under pirate articles for the better part of 6 years by his own account, longer than almost anyone else currently drinking in this particular tavern, and whose opinion on the pardon question carried a specific weight the newer arrivals lacked. Abrams had seen false rumours of pardons and amnesties come and go before, he told you one evening, without much visible bitterness about it, just the flat, practical caution of a man who'd learned not to plan his life around news that hadn't been confirmed yet. He'd also seen genuine ones, once, years earlier, and watched crews who'd taken that particular offer disappear back into ordinary colonial life within months, never seen or heard from again in these waters. Whether this current rumour belonged to the first category or the second was, as far as Abrams was concerned, entirely unknowable until an actual ship arrived carrying actual paper, rather than a sailor's second-hand memory of what he thought he'd heard someone else say. A specific evening near the end of your second week gave you a clearer picture of exactly how this eyewitness relay actually functioned in practice, rather than as an abstract description of tavern gossip. A sailor named Corwin, freshly arrived off a battered sloop that had apparently tangled with a Spanish Guadacosta vessel somewhere off Cuba, walked into the tavern still faintly bloodied, and within minutes had a crowd of perhaps 20 men gathered close enough to hear every word. He told the story once, loudly, for the benefit of the whole room, then found himself retelling pieces of it individually for another hour afterward, as smaller groups pulled him aside for more specific detail: how many guns the Spanish ship carried, how many of his own crew hadn't survived, whether the Spanish vessel had been working alone or as part of a larger patrol. You watched, fascinated despite yourself, as the story shifted subtly with each retelling, not through any deliberate dishonesty on Corwin's part, but simply through the ordinary human tendency to emphasize different details depending on who was asking and what they seemed most eager to hear. By the time the story had made its third or fourth circuit around the room, it bore only a loose resemblance to whatever Corwin had first said, and you found yourself wondering how much of everything else you'd heard in this tavern over the preceding 2 weeks had drifted the same way, one retelling at a time, from whatever had actually happened. By your third week ashore, the settlement's rough, improvised systems for actually verifying news had started to become clearer to you, less chaotic than they first appeared, even if they never approached anything resembling formal reliability. A ship arriving directly from a major port, Kingston or Charleston or Boston, carried more weight than one arriving after several intermediate stops, simply because fewer retellings had a chance to distort whatever it carried along the way. A captain known for careful, sober habits carried more credibility than one known for embellishment. A reputation economy running parallel to the reputation economy covered earlier tonight around pirate flags, except here what was being judged wasn't a captain's ferocity, but his reliability as a witness. And printed material, when it actually arrived, a genuine newspaper page, an actual copy of a proclamation, carried more weight than any amount of second-hand telling, precisely because it couldn't be softened or exaggerated in the retelling the way spoken word inevitably was. That printed proof finally arrived on what you'd later remember as the 11th day of your third week ashore, carried by a merchant sloop whose captain, recognizing an opportunity, made something close to a small public event of unrolling an actual printed copy of the King's proclamation on a barrel head outside the settlement's largest tavern, reading it aloud to a crowd that had gathered within minutes of word spreading that he had it. Word of the sloop's arrival had itself travelled the length of the waterfront in a matter of minutes, boys sent running between huts and taverns the way this settlement's fastest, if least official, messenger service always seemed to operate. And by the time the captain actually climbed atop his barrel, a genuinely substantial crowd, men from at least 3 or 4 different crews you recognised by their captains' reputations alone, had gathered close enough to hear. You stood near the back, close enough to hear but far enough to watch Abrams's face as the actual terms were read out, watching him do the same quiet arithmetic you imagined half the crowd was doing simultaneously, weighing years of accumulated risk against the specific, concrete offer finally sitting in front of everyone in black ink rather than rumour. The reaction that followed wasn't unified, and it wasn't calm, which surprised you less than it probably should have given 3 weeks of accumulated tension finally finding its release. Some men in the crowd began arguing immediately about whether the deadline specified left enough time to finish out a current voyage before surrendering. Others, Abrams among them by the look on his face, said nothing at all for a long moment, the particular stillness of a man doing math he'd apparently been avoiding doing for longer than he'd admitted. A few walked away from the reading entirely before it finished, already having decided, whatever the actual terms turned out to be, that the offer wasn't for them. Here's the thing about news this important arriving this way, all at once in public, read aloud to an entire settlement rather than filtering in gradually the way most information did. It collapsed weeks of uncertainty into a single, shared moment, and the settlement's mood shifted almost visibly in the hours that followed. The low, constant hum of speculation replaced by something more focused and considerably more anxious. Vendors who'd normally spend the afternoon hawking captured goods along the waterfront found themselves instead standing idle, watching small clusters of men argue over the proclamation's exact wording. Even the tavern itself, usually loud enough by mid-afternoon to make ordinary conversation difficult, fell into something closer to a low, uneasy murmur, the specific quiet of a room full of people all doing the same math at once. Congratulations, you'd just watched an entire improvised pirate town receive, all at once, the single most consequential piece of news any of them would hear that year, delivered the same way most news here had always arrived, by ship, by voice, by a man reading aloud from a piece of paper to a crowd that had no faster way of receiving it. By the following week, the settlement's population had visibly begun to shift, some men making quiet, practical preparations to present themselves for pardon, others doubling down on defiance in ways that felt, to you, more performative than genuinely confident. Loud talk in the tavern about continuing on regardless delivered a touch too forcefully to be entirely convincing. Abrams, for his part, spent that week mostly silent, and when you finally asked him directly what he intended to do, he gave an answer that stuck with you longer than almost anything else from your time ashore. 6 years was a long time to spend deciding whether a life could still be built somewhere else, and he wasn't sure he still remembered how to want anything except the sea and the particular, unglamorous work of cooperage he'd once made an honest living from, pardon or no pardon. He decided in the end, and told you himself the morning he made up his mind, sitting with a cup of rum he hadn't touched yet, that he'd take the offer. 6 years, he said, was long enough. He'd buried enough men he'd sailed with, celebrated enough narrow escapes that had started to feel less like luck and more like borrowed time running low, and he'd rather risk an uncertain peace than keep testing exactly how much longer that luck might hold. You walked with him down to the waterfront 2 days later, where a small group of men who'd made the same decision were gathering to arrange passage toward wherever the pardon could actually be formally received, and he shook your hand with the same unhurried, deliberate grip he brought to everything else, and said only that he hoped you'd still have your own hands to shake his with in a few years' time, wherever you both ended up. You never saw him again after that morning, never learned for certain whether he actually made it to whatever quieter life he'd been imagining, and that uncertainty, you'd come to realize much later, was itself the most honest possible ending to a story built entirely out of second-hand news and unconfirmed rumour. Some messages, it turned out, never came back at all, and you simply had to make your peace with not knowing, the same way this entire settlement had made its peace with never quite knowing anything for certain until a ship arrived to prove it. What you witnessed over those weeks ashore, watching an entire community process a single piece of consequential news arriving by the slowest possible method, taught you something about the actual shape of communication in this era that no flag code or lantern signal quite captured on its own. Information didn't just move from one ship to another out here. It moved through entire communities of people waiting, together in the same taverns and along the same waterfronts, piecing together a shared, evolving, frequently wrong understanding of a world none of them could see directly. Updating that understanding collectively every time a new sail appeared on the horizon, carrying whatever fragment of news it happened to hold. Not every piece of tavern news carried this kind of weight, and it's worth admitting that most of what circulated through that room on any given evening amounted to considerably lower stakes than pardons and Spanish patrols. A full third of any given evening's conversation, by your own rough estimate, concerned nothing more consequential than which captain currently owed which quartermaster money from a card game 2 settlements ago, or whose cook had produced a particularly memorable disaster of a meal the previous week, the pirate version, more or less, of an office gossip chain. If the office in question occasionally caught fire, and everyone carried a cutlass. There's something almost comforting in that, honestly, a reminder that even men living entirely outside the law still spent a considerable share of their days on the same small, petty, deeply human concerns as anyone else. Not every haven weathered this particular kind of news equally well, and by the final weeks of your stay, word had begun arriving, again second-hand, again uncertain, that a new governor was being sent to enforce the pardon in person, backed by actual naval vessels, rather than simply a printed proclamation left to circulate on its own. This news landed considerably heavier than the pardon announcement itself had, less an offer now than an approaching deadline with actual teeth behind it, and the settlement's mood, already anxious, tipped further towards something closer to genuine dread. Men who'd spent weeks debating the pardon in the abstract now found themselves debating something more urgent: how much time actually remained before the choice got made for them by force rather than left to their own timing. By the time your own ship's careening was finished and your captain called the crew back aboard to discuss the voyage ahead, roughly 9 weeks after you'd first stepped ashore smelling burnt sugar and old rum, you found yourself doing your own version of the same quiet arithmetic you'd watched Abrams do weeks earlier, weighing what you'd learned about the pardon, about the approaching governor, about the settlement's steadily shifting mood against whatever your own crew ultimately decided together, by the same voted process covered earlier tonight, about where to sail next, and whether to sail at all under the black flag once this particular voyage concluded. It hadn't felt, across those 9 weeks, like much of anything at all was happening. Just endless rum and rumour and idle waterfront walking. Looking back on it, though, you'd come to understand that this slow, communal absorption of news, however unreliable and however contradictory it often was, had shaped that decision just as much as any single dramatic encounter at sea ever could. That decision, whatever it turned out to be, belongs to a different night's telling. What mattered here, in this settlement, over these 9 weeks, was simply how thoroughly an entire scattered population of outlaws had managed to stay informed, however imperfectly, about a world none of them could see directly, using nothing more sophisticated than rum, conversation, and a genuine communal hunger for news that never quite stopped, no matter how many false rumours arrived first. There's a particular kind of wonder in that, easy to miss beneath the tedium of all that waiting. An entire settlement, with no newspaper of its own, no formal communication network, nothing but taverns and waterfronts and men willing to talk to strangers, had still managed to function as a genuinely effective information system, slow and unreliable by any modern standard, but somehow sufficient to let hundreds of scattered, independent decision-makers each arrive at their own conclusions about a world none of them could fully see. It never worked perfectly, and it never worked fast. And yet across weeks of rumour, contradiction, and the occasional piece of hard-printed proof, this entire lawless, improvised town had still managed, collectively, to stay roughly abreast of a world changing considerably faster than any of them could individually track. You'd spend the rest of your life, however long that turned out to be, comparing every piece of important news you ever received again to the particular communal texture of that pardon's arrival, not a message delivered to you alone, but one absorbed together, in public, by an entire town holding its breath at once. Somewhere back at the very start of tonight's journey, a lookout aboard a Bristol-registered merchant sloop watched an ordinary flag come down and a black one rise in its place, and felt, in the space of that single change, the entire weight of a system built with nothing more than cloth, rope, gunfire, and the willingness of strangers to trust what a colour meant. That system, it turns out, never really ended with the flag. It was there in Ned's frostbitten hands on a signal halyard, in the harbour at Nassau, that stayed exactly where every scattered pirate expected it to stay, in Kofi, crouching down to speak gently to a frightened boy in a language nobody else on deck could offer him, in a chest of medicine rowed slowly across Charleston's harbour while an entire city held its breath, in Willet's careful walk across a rolling deck after the articles kept their promise to him, in Maynard's hidden crew waiting in silence for a lie to finish doing its work, and in Abrams, 6 years into a life he'd finally decided to leave, shaking your hand once and disappearing into a piece of news nobody ever confirmed for certain. None of it moved fast. None of it moved the way information moves now, instantly, invisibly, taken so completely for granted that most of us never once consider what it actually costs to simply know something the moment it happens somewhere else. Every message in tonight's story had to be carried, by hand, by boat, by a nervous sailor counting seconds between a flash and a bang, by a whole town gathered around a barrel-head straining to hear a proclamation read aloud. And yet it worked, again and again, well enough to coordinate ambushes across open ocean, well enough to negotiate a hostage's life, well enough to hold together crews of strangers who had every reason in the world not to trust each other, and somehow mostly did anyway. Nassau is a cruise port now. The harbour at Ocracoke is a quiet stretch of protected coastline. Charleston's wharves handle container ships instead of hostage negotiations, and nobody alive remembers Ned's name, or Willet's, or Abrams's, except the 2,000 or so words tonight spent trying to imagine what their days might actually have felt like. That's the honest truth about almost everyone in this story, the named and the unnamed alike. Most of them left no more trace than a rumour passed through a tavern, absorbed by a crowd, and gradually forgotten. You're warm right now. You're not waiting on a rowboat to learn whether you'll survive the week. Nobody's asking you to trust a stranger's flag with your life, or your fingers, or your leg. Whatever's coming for you tomorrow, it isn't a signal gun, and it isn't a black flag rising up someone else's mast. You're warm. You're safe. Tonight, that's enough.